Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Was Trapped in Space? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Things weren't supposed to go this way. He'd finally made it to space. He'd worked so hard, studying every night and exercising so that he could meet the basic fitness requirements for the academy. So why was Tsubasa here? Izuku knew that his grades weren't the best and he couldn't have possibly passed the normal physical, but there he was, smugly staring at Izuku as he had been the entire trip to the outer station. This was supposed to be a fresh start. This was going to be a new place where Izuku could meet other kids who were as passionate about space as he was. Then everything clicked together. One of the instructors came out to greet them as they were disembarking their shuttle and introduced himself to the crowd of gawking students. Of course, Tsubasa's grandpa worked at the station. He was always bragging that he had connections in space and Izuku would be lucky to ever get the chance to see the stars from anywhere but his apartment roof. And now he was here to rub in Izuku's face that even out in space he wasn't safe from his problems. While Dr. Garaki droned on about what a privilege it was for all these bright youthful faces to experience life on the station, Izuku kept his head down, making sure all attention stayed off him. And just because you're here now doesn't mean you're experts in the field yet. For example, who can tell me how many moons there are in our solar system? Izuku was surprised that no one raised their hands. Surely the first place everyone started learning about the universe was their own solar system. He didn't have to draw attention to himself, not that he would have. Tsubasa raised his hand and singled him out. Izuku here was in my class and he knows everything about space, don't you Izuku? Everyone was looking at him now and his anxiety skyrocketed. I wouldn't say I know everything. Well then, son, pipe up, how many moons are there in our solar system? 181, currently that is. You never know what might happen. A moon might be knocked out of orbit or another piece of space debris might get caught in a planet's gravitational pull and become reclassified. Izuku didn't mean to yell, but he was nervous and all of his muscles tensed, keeping him standing straight. He couldn't help the answers immediately spilling from his mouth. Very good. That question usually stumps the newbies. All right then, what is the most common type of star in the Milky Way? Red dwarfs, sir. Where's the hottest place in the known universe? Virgo. The coldest? The Boomerang Nebula. All right, and how much of the known universe is composed of dark matter, young man? About 27%, sir. There was silence for a few moments before Dr. Garaki began to laugh, slow clapping in approval. I'm impressed, you lot might just make it through the academy here. Moving on, the ship has multiple safety measures for all kinds of emergency situations. Over here we have, Izuku took a deep breath, slumping in on himself and following the crowd as they continued the tour. He missed the glare Tsubasa was throwing his way. Izuku didn't know what was going on. One moment he was packing away his things in his assigned room and the next there was a loud screeching noise and strobing red lights everywhere. It was an alarm, but he couldn't tell what kind yet. Was there a fire? A hole in one of the walls? An alien attack? Well, that last one was unlikely, but it still stood that there was some kind of emergency. Most of the other kids were also confused, leaving their rooms and spilling out into the hallways. Tsubasa, normally scowling, was with another group of the kids they'd arrived with, a look of fear on his face. He locked eyes with Izuku, then motioned for him to follow, running down one of the hallways. What's going on? That's the evacuation alarm. It's telling everyone to get to the nearest escape pod and leave the station. I know where they are, just follow me. It wasn't long before they reached a hallway with many circular ports, each one its own escape pod. All you have to do is sit in the front seat and hit the blue autopilot button next to the steering wheel. It'll take you to the nearest safe house. Izuku was scrambling to do as told, not wanting to find out just what caused the alarm in the first place. He didn't notice that there should have been others from the ship trying to evacuate too. After putting on the seatbelt and pressing the blue button, the pod doors began to close, and that's when Izuku heard it. But why were the others laughing in this situation? Risking a glance back, Izuku learned the truth. It was all a trick. Tsubasa had his smug smirk back and was waving his fingers delicately at Izuku. The other kids were in on it, and even with the blaring alarm and the closing doors, Izuku could see them laughing beside his old bully. He tried to unbuckle the seatbelt and dive back into the main ship, but it was too late and Tsubasa had the gall to blow him a kiss as the doors shut and he was ejected into space. Trying to undo his seatbelt was a mistake, and when the escape pod shot forward, Izuku was flung to the back of the ship. He would have a nasty bruise later, but he had to get back in the main seat before the ship changed directions again. It was easier said than done. The pod had basic gravity controls to keep the ground as the ground, but aside from that, there was nothing to dampen any G-force made in other directions. He had no idea where he was going, the only person from the station heading who knows where due to the programming, and he wasn't in the pilot's seat to steer clear of any obstacles. Eventually, he made his way back, buckling up and looking out the front window, but all he could see was space. Obviously, Earth had to be behind him, but he didn't have any formal training on how to maneuver the pod. All he wanted was to get back to the station and hope that Tsubasa didn't somehow try to frame the alarm on him and imply he did it on purpose to take a safety pod for a joyride. Knowing him, he would absolutely take this opportunity to get Izuku kicked from his dream program. Ignoring all the buttons and levers, Izuku began to search all the cubbies and compartments of the pod, finding a first aid kit, some ration-grade granola bars, water bottles, and a manual for the ship. Ignoring the emergency supplies, Izuku cracked open the book, hoping it would have something useful like a homing button to return to the station. On page 8 his blood ran cold. The blue button, the one labeled autopilot, may just have killed him. Izuku wasn't sure if Tsubasa did it on purpose, but the escape pods came equipped with their flight programs in emergency situations built in. Autopilot is the default setting, and Tsubasa telling Izuku to press the button turned it off, erasing the previous coordinates. Izuku wasn't traveling to a safe house, he was going in a straight line into the unknown with limited food, fuel, and electricity and would have to learn to fly the ship soon or risk dying alone in space. Pages of the driver's manual flew by quickly as Izuku raced to absorb as much information as he could. After learning the basics, Izuku was able to turn off the thrusters, but because space was space, he was still careening into the abyss at breakneck speeds. Turning in these conditions would undoubtedly lead to a spin-out that would be impossible to control, and Izuku had a weak stomach as it was, so as carefully as he could, Izuku found the front thrusters and slowly turned them on. It wasn't perfect, of course. The ship wobbled dangerously and Izuku had to delicately adjust how much he turned each dial to keep the path straight as it slowed, but eventually he managed to get the ship to a crawl. Taking a moment to just breathe, Izuku slumped in his seat. This was a disaster. If his mom found out this happened on the first day, she'd pull him from the program. He'd worked way too hard to stop here. Squaring his shoulders, Izuku finished reading the manual, skimming it one more time to be sure he wouldn't accidentally kill himself, and started to steer the ship. He couldn't see the station anymore, he was so far away, but he could see Earth off in the distance. Turning the thrusters back on, he began to move forward, but after just a minute, everything came to a complete halt. Escape pods weren't built for finesse, and it's impossible to get them to come to a complete stop without crashing into another object or planet. So coming to a complete stop in the middle of space was a huge red flag. Turning up the thrusters did nothing, and then he was slowly moving backwards. There were no windows behind the pod, but Izuku was fairly sure that another ship was pulling his pod into their docking bay. He was close to Earth, so he was probably just being paranoid. Were space pirates even a thing? It was probably a scouting ship that had been notified of the missing space pod. Izuku hoped that it was just other humans as he turned off the thrusters. He'd be in so much trouble, but he'd rather deal with angry astronauts than hostile alien pirates. He was able to see the doors to space close as his pod was manually docked, and after the atmosphere was equalized, his pod was opened from the outside. A toad-like alien shot a dart into his arm once he was in sight, and Izuku passed out with one final thought. It was alien pirates. Aizawa had lived through many bad days. He had dealt with numerous high-stress situations and even participated in official HPSC missions before settling into his role as a teacher at the United Association run by Nizu, but getting captured during a training flight was still pretty high on his list of worst experiences. He fought as well as he could, of course, but most of his students weren't combat-oriented and those that could fight were still young, so the band of outlaws were able to overpower them. Azawa was able to take out one of their eyes before going down, but as good as it felt, he knew they'd probably try to get retribution at some point for that. Azawa hoped that their ship would be found soon so the search efforts could begin, but until then he would have to keep his students safe. They woke up in a cell. A line of cells if the visible cells in front of them were any indication. It was difficult to see just how long the hallways were, but this was obviously a stolen criminal transport ship. Obviously it was an older model, so it was probably found in some illegal trading district for auction. These things were supposed to get scrapped after retirement, but there must be some corrupt official trying to make a quick buck behind the scenes. If it were a standard model and not altered, this should be the only area with holding cells, and even if he couldn't see down the hallway, he used to serve on one of these ships so the floor plan would be similar. Hopefully. He was still an intern at the time, not much older than his current students at the moment, but he could do this. Just find an opening, take out the guards, and fly back to UA. But though the thought was nice, it would be damn near impossible to execute if the guards were smart, which they seemed to be unfortunately. Each cell was made up of 3 solid walls and an electrified metal gate with the main and food doors leading to the main hallway. Usually, they were only mildly charged to discourage escape attempts, but Azawa could hear the electricity buzzing from the back of the cell and knew that it would more than just sting if anyone touched the gate. His students could tell too and gave the door a wide berth. It was quiet in the hallway most of the time, especially when the guards came in to deliver food, but Azawa knew there were others in the rest of the cells. He could see the cell in front of him as well as 2 cells to either side, and all were occupied. Another thing supporting this theory was their unexpected cellmate. Eri was a very young deathfly sprite. Azawa had no idea how they managed to capture her with all the protections on their species in place, but she became very attached to Azawa as soon as he presented himself as a non-aggressive adult protector. The fact that he hadn't been split apart from his students meant that the other cages were most likely filled with volatile sentients and creatures. If they were unwilling to risk some of his more fragile students to unnecessary fights, then keeping them together was the lesser risk, which did not bode well for the motives of these criminals. Maybe they would only be held for ransom after they made their grand escape from HSPC territory, but Azawa knew the statistics for underground trade and auctions. Azawa himself was a LYX and would sell for a lot on the black market. Azawa hoped that Zashi would send out a search party as soon as they were even less than half a cycle late. Azawa was rarely late. He could see that with every solar rotation that passed, his students lost more hope. Even the proud Bakgo was waning in his long-winded monologues, chastising the rest of you for not finding them sooner. He stopped mentioning it after nearly 2 lunar rotations had passed. They were definitely far away from HPSC territory now, and their chances of rescue were only diminishing. They were all settled into the usual routine when out of the blue, Azawa's fur raised on end. He heard arguing from the guards down the hall. It was too early in the cycle for meal time, and the telltale dragging sound meant that they had a new arrival. I'm saying that it's a death worlder. It can handle being in a cell with the other merchandise. And I'm saying it looks way too small and fragile. It wouldn't last a minute surrounded by the other sentients. What about the deathfly sprite? Are you willing to risk its safety in the off chance this isn't one of the fabled savages new to the Alliance? The LYX will keep the sprite safe. There are plenty of easier prey options in their cell if it is dangerous and it's too small to eat all of them. They're the least temperamental captures we have, even with the Draget in their group. It's going in with them, and if something happens we'll reconsider, but without a strength assessment, I can't imagine something this fleshy surviving with anything else. Fine, but you're taking the fall if anything happens? Once in view, Azawa could see a small creature curled up on a rucksack being dragged by the arguing guards. It was asleep, most likely drugged to high hell like they all were after getting captured. The door to their cell was opened quickly and the guards lifted the rough fabric, rolling the unknown species into their cell. Everyone was backed into the far corner. The term Death Worlder was respected for good reason. You never knew what a Death World could produce. Azawa left Eri with Ciro as he stalked forward to investigate. Yup, definitely drugged, And with how much Fogget neurotoxin Azawa could smell, it was obviously overkill for something this small. It would be out for at least a cycle, probably two. Azawa couldn't smell much else over the Fogget toxin, the antiseptic they used to sanitize the creature, and the detergent on the gray garb they forced all their captures to wear, but it was obviously a mammal. Its limbs and torso were hidden in the gray fabric, so he only had the face to observe. Front set eyes, so it was a predator, not a great sign, but its mouth was parted to reveal flat teeth. An omnivore perhaps? It didn't seem to have much fur, rather it had a mane at the top of its crown, probably for aesthetic purposes to attract a mate, or maybe camouflage if the foliage on its home planet was that shade of green. Taking in more of its features, Azawa cross-referenced it with other species he knew or had heard of and immediately recoiled when he realized exactly what it was, startling his students. What is it, Azawa? Don't get too close, that's a Terran Deathworlder. We're screwed. Izuku had a pounding headache when he woke up, and everything was stiff. Oh, no wonder. He was sleeping on concrete. But why was he? He was captured by space pirates. Noise from behind Izuku drew his attention, and he saw the strangest group of creatures he'd ever seen staring right at him. His first reaction was to curl in on himself and whine. They all seemed high-strung, him sitting up so abruptly must have startled them. But they weren't creatures, were they? No, they were all wearing the same thing, gray garments neutral enough to fit their body structures in a one-size-fits-all kind of way. Upon closer inspection, he was also wearing them. The tops seemed to be a circle with a neck hole in the middle, like a flowy poncho, and the bottom was similar, a circle with a larger hole lined with elastic. So a skirt and a poncho, huh? Not the most comfortable thing in the world, but also not too revealing aside from the fact that he didn't have any underwear on. They must have taken his old clothes when he was captured. What did they want from him, though? Well, seeing as he wasn't the only one here, it most likely wasn't personal. Izuku tensed when he heard footsteps approaching, sliding away from the hallway and holding his legs to himself, staring through the bars. Two aliens in some kind of haphazard uniform appeared with a cart. They seemed surprised that he was staring at them, not that Izuku knew why. They knew he was here now after all, but maybe he was misinterpreting the looks on their faces too. He hadn't had his first classes yet, so he didn't know any common, let alone how different species communicated with each other in their own physical and verbal ways. There was some talk from the guards, but eventually a small door was opened near the floor, just big enough to fit a tray of food and water through. It was slammed shut as soon as the tray was slid in and the guards moved on to the next cell. Izuku glanced back at the other aliens and all of them were still staring at him, probably trying to see what he would do. Izuku wasn't too surprised. Humans were very new to the whole Space Alliance thing. A hostile race of hamster-like aliens had tried to invade Earth and enslave humanity, but the war was so short it may as well have been a joke. In fact, many newly written history books wrote it off as such. After deconstructing and studying their technology, other species made contact with the first human explorers. After the language barrier was breached, it was a scramble for knowledge. Humans couldn't get too far away from the solar system without help yet, but the HPSC was happy enough to catch scholars up with the most up-to-date history on the sentient universe. Apparently, the weak hamster race were well renowned in the universe as tyrants. Though small, their strong teeth and sharp intellects carried them far, and their overwhelming numbers and teamwork helped them conquer many planets and claim them as their property. Earth had been underestimated, though. The many lights of cities visible in space attracted the crafty conquerors, and with so many lights in so many places, the planet was obviously ideal for colonization. It wasn't until after they'd invaded that they'd realized Earth was a death world by galactic standards. The polar areas are very cold, the equator is fairly hot, and the wobbly axis of the world changes the weather and temperature of everything in between to strange volatile levels. And that's aside from the fact that nowhere is safe from extreme phenomena wreaking havoc on the planet's surface. Too flat? Tornadoes? Lots of mountains? The Earth is constantly moving, so the occasional earthquake is to be expected. Even normal storms can bring deadly electricity or large ice projectiles. They didn't stand a chance of surviving the weather, let alone the plants and animals adapted to live there, or the very angry humans not wishing to be enslaved by small fuzzy overlords. Earth was a fair bit larger than most other habitable planets, so even the gravity was hard on them without their technology. Humans also have the tendency to get very violent very quickly, so after the massacre of the would-be invaders, it was understandable that the HPSC would be reluctant to fully integrate humans to their services until after a thorough probation period where humans could prove not to be complete savages. This is where Izuku came in. The government had made contact. Humans claimed the solar system as their territory, and Izuku's generation would be the first to join the HPSC once the probation was lifted. Izuku had worked hard to get accepted to the program that would teach him galactic common, history, and universally accepted measurements of time, distance, weight, and length amongst other things. He would even have had the chance to take video classes with other intergalactic schools with mixed species classes. If he hadn't been captured, reality crashed back into Izuku like a semi-truck as he stared at the food on the floor. There were several cups filled with tater-tot-sized pellets and several disposable containers of what Izuku hoped was water. He was closest to the tray with the cups. Picking one up, he took a sniff. Yup, definitely not human food. It smelled like a household cleaner. It definitely had some kind of plant humans couldn't digest mixed in. Opening the lid to one of the liquid containers revealed that if it wasn't water, it was a pretty close alternative. There was no taste or smell, so Izuku hoped it wasn't some kind of poison. Looking back to the corner, he realized that none of the others had gone for the food yet. Yes. Humans are space orcs as eloquently put by famous astronaut Toshinori Yagi. Most other species didn't know anything about humans aside from how deadly their planet was and how brutal they were to their first invaders. Trying to keep his movements as smooth and slow as possible, Izuku placed his cup of rations back on the tray and scooted it towards the other aliens. The lizard-looking one hissed at him, but he ignored it to the best of his ability. He didn't get too close, and after he thought it was near enough to them, he grabbed his water and backed away. The panther-like one never broke its gaze, curled protectively in front of the others. Izuku broke eye contact first, forcing himself to look away as he heard the others start to move around and take their food. Prolonged eye contact was uncomfortable for most species, so a potential hostile creature staring at you was good enough to put anyone off, and they needed to eat. Izuku was still far too high-strung to eat himself, but he could at least try to listen to them as they started to speak quietly and maybe pick up some common. Maybe. How was the Death Worlder up already? One moment it was dead to the world, and the next it stood up straight, looking around the cell. Aizawa had everyone huddled in the corner behind him, and the sight of such a large group seemed to unease the Terran. Aizawa hoped it wasn't trying to make any threat displays at them. None of them could see its body under the prison garb. After a long, uncomfortable staring contest, seriously this thing had to be a predator to hold eye contact for that long, it swiveled its head towards the hallway. A moment later, the mid-cycle meal cart could be heard rolling in. Okay, so it had good hearing, sneaking probably wouldn't work on it then. Oh stars, it's awake. How is it up already? Criff used what was supposed to be the highest dose that was safe for its size. Well, I guess it's a good thing we brought it a ration then. None of the others seem to be missing any limbs. What do you think? Should we move it to another cell? I'm not touching anything that can shake off Fogget neurotoxin that quickly. Like you said, none of the others in its cell are hurt. Let's just hurry up and move on. The bastard slid in the tray only far enough for the Terran Death Worlder to reach, and Aizawa could see from here that the creature was tense. It waited until the guards were gone before relaxing some. Then it picked up a ration cup and smelled it. It must not have liked what it smelled because it put the cup back down. It did accept a water ration before looking back at everyone huddled in the corner. It seemed to deliberate for a few moments before coming to some kind of realization. It choreographed its movements to push the tray closer to them. Bakugo hissed in warning, and if Aizawa wasn't afraid his own hiss would be met with aggression, he would have scolded the Draget. But that's all the Terran did. They had a spare ration cup to share since the Terran didn't want to eat theirs. It even turned to face away, an act of either practiced kindness or extreme indifference. Aizawa wasn't going to complain. He didn't think he or any of his students would have been able to eat with the gaze of a predator locked on them. Eri was the only one that didn't seem outright terrified by the thing, but she would be their early warning system. Deathfly sprites are highly empathetic and can feel the emotions of those around them. Usually it's only surface level, but if they focus, they can try to read a creature's true intentions. It's very hard to sneak up on a deathfly sprite. Bakugo was the first to break the silence, and the rest of his chosen horde joined in shortly after. It has some nerve turning its back on such a large group. Dude, what if it can understand you? Shut it, Sparky. That thing hasn't said a word since it got here. It might be from that stupid death world, but nothing with that much exposed flesh and flat teeth could be a predator. It's probably something they selectively bred to farm for meat. It obviously had fur to hide in plants, and the real Terrans needed it gone for easy processing. The fact that the stupid guards put it in sentient clothes doesn't mean jack if they don't even know what it is. I dunno, it seems plenty smart to me. It isn't acting like a wild animal. That's because it's domesticated. Probably grew up in some kind of farm, so it's used to cells and cages. Don't spout off lies with confidence, Bakugo. If you don't know anything about a creature, then don't assume and fill others with false knowledge. Bakugo stayed silent at Azue's warning. It was hard to instill the fact that it's okay not to know everything to a Draget. They're boastful by nature and will impulsively act as if they're the best in any situation, a habit not easily broken but necessary to instill in young recruits so they can work well in groups later on in life. I wonder why it's not eating. Don't worry about it, Pinky. If it doesn't want to eat, that just means more for us. They don't fill these cups up nearly enough. I'll take your share if you don't want it. The Eep glared at Bakugo unamused. Maybe it's just not hungry? Well, I'll keep eating its rations while it's not hungry then, Spiderweb. Bakugo was almost aggressively munching on his ration pellets. Even if Azua was right about him being full of hot air, it still sucked being called out for it. He was pretty sure he was right too. That thing didn't look like any kind of predator Bakugo knew of. Bakugo was a predator. He had sharp teeth and tough scales. He had pointed claws and hunter's instincts. Whatever was huddled across the cell was the complete opposite of a hunter. It was cowering like prey. Bakugo had nothing to worry about. He continued eating but never took his gaze off the Terran. Izuku was bored. After the initial shock had worn off, there was only so much one could do in a cell. Even less so if that cell was occupied by other sentients you couldn't talk to and were afraid of you, so you had to stay away or risk getting into some kind of self-defensive fight. It was interesting to listen to the others talk, but he knew that every time he looked over to them it made them nervous. He knew what it was like to be nervous, so he avoided looking in their corner, despite how curious he was. He instead observed the cells he could see in front of him. Only 5 were visible from the hallway, but they were all occupied, and Izuku didn't think all of the occupants were sentient. The marker seemed to be the gray clothes. If you had clothes, you were probably civilized, if not then probably an animal, and behavior seemed to reflect this. One creature, a vaguely gorilla-like thing if gorillas were purple and roughly the size of golden retrievers, wasn't wearing the garb and merely paced the whole time. The cockroach-looking alien in the next cell over was wearing the gray garb and sat against the cell wall, staring and glaring at everything much like Izuku was currently doing. He didn't stare at the alien long. Even if it was a bug, discontent is easy to portray no matter what species you are. It had barely been one day and Izuku was going insane with boredom, and his stomach wasn't helping. He wished he had one of the granola bars from back at the escape pod. The last thing he remembered eating was lunch before boarding the shuttle heading to the station. One day then? Izuku didn't know how long he was out for, but that was probably as close as he was gonna get in his estimate. It was only a few hours later when the cart came back. Izuku wasn't as tense this time now that he knew it was just food being delivered, but he still looked out towards the hallway to be sure. He was avoiding his cellmates because they were in the same position as him. He would not give the guards the same courtesy. His staring seemed to put them off, so that was a bonus. What he didn't know was whatever the fruit they placed on their tray this time was. It was obviously meant for one of the other inhabitants, but he could smell it when he got close enough to take his water, and it smelled like food. It was obviously some kind of citrus. It was pinkish red, almost like the interior color of a grapefruit, but it smelled like something in between a lemon and an orange. It probably had vitamin C, which he would need if he didn't want to get scurvy. He really was captured by space pirates? He picked it up and there was a whine from the corner. The pink sheep-like alien seemed apprehensive. It was probably for them then. Well, he wouldn't take much. If it were like any other citrus, it would have slices already grown in. Just one piece. As carefully as he could, Izuku held up one finger. He held it up for several seconds before carefully tearing the peel away from the lorange. Well, he'd call it that until he knew what they were actually called. He was right about the pre-made slices and gently pulled one apart from the rest. Carefully, he placed the fruit back onto the tray and pushed it to the corner, making it obvious that he was trading his ration for the fruit slice. It was a fairly large fruit too, not quite the size of a small cantaloupe, but close to it. It wouldn't satiate him, not by a long shot, but it would be enough. Licking his lips, he paused when he heard a distressed grunt come from the group. Taking the chance to look at them, they all seemed surprisingly pensive about something. Was it because he was taking their food? Surely they would be fine with just one slice missing. The panther-like alien took a step forward and Izuku wasted no time shoving the slice into his mouth. It almost didn't fit and he accidentally bit into the end of the fruit as he did so, but it was so good. He didn't even mean to react that way. He was just so hungry and he didn't want them to take the food away. Just one slice. Whenever they brought the fruit, he would only take one slice. Izuku eagerly licked his fingers and wiped the drop that ran down his chin, licking that too. It was really sour, probably just a hair more sour than a lemon, but it tasted just like it smelled, somewhere between an orange and a lime. With just a bit of sugar it would make an amazing drink, but his empty stomach was probably biased. If he only ate citrus it might screw with his digestion, but food was food. He didn't touch his water for a while after that. Water right after citrus just never tasted great, and though he wasn't sated he was happy that he had something to eat. The lights went out a few minutes after the guards came to pick up their trays and Izuku was suddenly aware of how alone he was. He turned to look at the group and they seemed to melt into a large cuddle pile, the panther alien taking the front like a guard. It was obviously a protective measure. Despite settling down, it didn't look like it would be sleeping anytime soon. Izuku didn't know how long their days or nights lasted, but he would try to get some sleep while it was dark. The floor was concrete though, and his clothes were large and flowy enough to hide his form, but offered no cushioning whatsoever. There were no pillows, so the best Izuku could do was lay down and place his head on his arm. He faced away from the group and couldn't help but get lost in his thoughts. What was his mom doing? Did she know he was missing? Did anyone know he'd been kidnapped? Would they assume he was dead and stop looking for him? Would he be blamed for the alarm at the station and stealing the pod in the first place? God, he missed his mom. He just wanted to go home. The Death Worlder was surprisingly docile. It kept to itself, avoided staring at everyone, and remained relatively quiet. More points to it being sentient, or at least domesticated as Bakko suggested. Azawa wasn't convinced though. Even if it wasn't a predator, it most certainly wasn't prey either. Even domesticated prey kept their side-facing eyes. That was a basic law of evolution no matter what planet you came from. So, if it wasn't prey, what was the reason? Was it poisonous? Did it not have enough nutrients to be considered prey? It came from a death world, so it couldn't be an exception to the rule like some that lived in areas with no predators to be seen. No matter how weak it looked, the Terran's eyes told Azawa that this had to be a death world predator. Maybe not an apex predator, but something in between at least. Although Azawa may have had to reconsider the poisonous point at dinner. I hate how it stares. It looks like it wants to pounce at me. That's just how its eyes are. They said its pupils didn't contract normally during its examination. Apparently they're always that round. Well, it's freaky. At least it hasn't touched any of the others yet. Daki would have our heads if the deathfly sprite was hurt. Well, I told you to put it in another cell. You're lucky it's so mild. Whatever, let's just finish this so we can go to bed. Yeah. Let's just hope it's not a nocturnal hunter. The nightly rations were slid into the cell and Azawa hoped that the Terran would just take its portion and slide the tray over like earlier, but it seemed instantly fixated on Naas Yanjine. It had probably never seen anything like it before since most planets didn't grow fruit quite like them. Naas race had actually cultivated them over generations into what they were today, and they were a near essential part of their diet, even if they were toxic. Apes, as far as sentient species go, are a classic example of a prey species, but they made up for it through generations of agriculture and evolution. Initially, they had supposedly rubbed the fruit on their fur to ward off predators, but as the fruit they grew became more appealing to insects, they had to change their strategy. Some members of their species had grown somewhat tolerant of the acid in the fruit, and though it wasn't intentional, most members started choosing mates with higher and higher tolerance levels. Eventually, after a few generations, the first members that could physically eat the fruit were born, and even if they couldn't properly digest the fruit, their bodies were able to take what few nutrients were available and store the rest in their epidermis, turning their skin as pink as the juice. Their natural predators tended to start avoiding the Yeeps with bright pink skin, and eventually they were able to thrive enough after their main threat was gone to join the galactic frontier. Despite the fact that they developed special glands in their wrists and ankles to secrete a more potent acid refined from the Yanjine fruit they ate, they weren't given a probationary period like most newcomers because of their docile temperament. Yanjines still hold vitamins that are essential to Yeeps, so the Terran taking an interest in Naas was worrying. The guards only gave her one fruit a day at dinner, and though missing a few days wouldn't kill her, eventually she would lose her pink hue and become weaker. The Death Worlder seemed fascinated though. Na quietly whined as it inspected her Yanjine, probably not realizing how sensitive the Terran's hearing was before it swiveled its head to look at her. Its intelligence again astounded Azawa, and he would have to consider treating it more like a sentient if the trend continued. It held up one of its fingers for a prolonged moment and then gently peeled away one slice of the Yanjine. It again only took water from the tray, sliding its food ration over along with the rest of the Yanjine, but what was it planning on doing? Azawa thought that maybe it would try to save the slice to squirt juice into a guard's eye or something similar if it could tell that the fruit contained acid, but when it started to sniff at it as if to eat it, he panicked. It was going to give itself chemical burns. Yeeps spent generations building a tolerance for Yanjines. The only other species sometimes able to digest them were those with insectoid features. The Terran was obviously a mammal, there were no doubts there. Did it think that because there was fruit on the tray that it was safe to eat? Did it not recognize the ration pellets as food and think that this was the first real food it had been given since its arrival? Or maybe, just maybe, was it trying to injure itself to try and escape through the medical wing? No matter the case, Azawa had to stop it. Not even the Yeeps could digest the acid, their bodies just stored it for use against threats until it was benign enough to get absorbed into their bloodstream for proper disposal. The Terran had proven to be close to sentience if it wasn't already, and Azawa wouldn't let it harm itself. He made a move to lunge and grab the fruit, but the Terran was too fast, quickly shoving the slice into its mouth. Azawa thought that it would spit it out, maybe start coughing and hacking, but it was humming contentedly. It spilled a few drops in its haste and even moved to wipe and lick the remnants, savoring the fruit as if it were a delicacy. So Terran Deathworlders could eat acid. Good to know. Azawa wasn't the only one horrified by the revelation, but no one else made any comments on it either. The rest of dinner was quiet and the lights turned off for the lunar cycle after the guards collected their food trays. The thought of the Terran being a nocturnal hunter would not leave Azawa's brain. He knew the guards were probably just trying to psych him out earlier, but it was a valid theory. Azawa would probably not get any sleep tonight. The Terrans seemed to watch them forlornly as everyone settled down for bed. This was one of the only times Bakgo would willingly snuggle with the others, even if he would never call it that, due to his species being cold-blooded. Even those who slept mostly on the floor still had another body to rest their head on, and the affectionately named cuddle pile was a valid survival tactic in unforgiving environments. Azawa assumed the position as watch for the night, laying in front of the group as they settled down. Azawa hoped that the Death Worlder wouldn't stare at him all night, and it thankfully rolled over, trying to make itself comfortable on the concrete. It seemed fine for a while, but then its breathing became uneven and it started to quietly wheeze. At first Azawa thought that it was finally having a reaction to the Yanjine, but after more observation it was obvious what was happening. Not many sentients could cry, but it was obvious when one who could was. Azawa was sure that if the Terran turned around its eyes would be moist. It seemed docile enough, so the thought that it was sad pulled at Azawa's heartstrings. This was why he became a licensed pro-hero with the HPSC, to save creatures and sentients who needed help. A fine job he was doing now. What's wrong with it? I don't care, but it needs to shut up. Some of us are trying to sleep. Give it a break, guys. It's really sad right now. Yeah? And how would you know, spiderweb? It's crying. It's something my race does when we're overwhelmed with emotions, usually sadness. It's true. Everyone went quiet. It was rare that Eri spoke, and because she could feel the emotions of beings around her, there was no doubt that she was reading into the Terran. They're sad and lonely. They want their Azawa. What? Denki placed his paws over his mouth at how loud he was. They want someone the same way I would want Azawa if he were gone. They want their Azawa. Azawa sighed and gently nuzzled the little sprite. They want their family, Eri. They miss the other Terrans. Eri shook her head. No, it's only one that they miss. It feels like how everyone here sees you sometimes. They want their Azawa. Azawa wasn't going to argue further than that. The Terran probably had someone it was very close to wherever it came from. He would ignore the twitch in his gut that now screamed this was probably a lost child wishing for its parent. He hoped beyond hope that this wasn't the case. Azawa could relate to the feeling of missing friends and family. He would sacrifice one of his tails to see Zashi again. The other dilemma was that they now had a crying death worlder in their cell. Against his better judgment, Azawa chuffed loud enough to get the Terran's attention. His students tensed behind him, but none of them said a word. As Azawa suspected, there were trails of liquid running down the sides of its face, but they were wiped away after the Terran got up to give Azawa his attention. In what Azawa hoped was a universal invitation, he lifted one of his arms. The Terran seemed hesitant, but slowly crept closer. When Azawa didn't discourage the action, it carefully nestled against him. Azawa would, of course, keep himself between his students and the Terran, but no sentient or semi-sentient alien should sleep on cold concrete when there was a perfectly good cuddle pile nearby. It was heavier than he thought it would be, but luckily his students were able to relax after it didn't attack anyone right away, and Azawa started to purr to help some of them fall asleep. The Terran seemed to like this and fell into its own slumber fairly quickly. Maybe they weren't complete savages after all. This one seemed nice at least. Izuku woke up slowly. The sight of the cell disoriented him at first, but then he realized where he was. There was a warm weight over his shoulder, and he suddenly remembered that the freaking panther invited him to snuggle last night. Of course, it had to be sentient. It was wearing the gray clothes like all the others in his cell, and they all seemed to be sentient too, but why did they invite him to join them last night? Maybe the fact that he hadn't gone into some kind of psychopathic rage helped get rid of their initial fear? He stole one of their fruits though, that hardly warranted a gesture as kind as sleeping together. He hoped it was just pity. Even if he didn't want to feel pathetic, he was a stolen kid alone in space. He was allowed to be scared. As carefully as he could, he moved away from the embrace of the panther alien. It seemed to be awake already and let him go willingly. Izuku sat up and looked at the group in the corner. This was the closest he'd ever been to them, and he tried to drink in their features while he could from this distance. It really was a strange gathering. There was the panther, of course, except it had 3 long tails and looked like it would be just as comfortable walking on 2 legs as the 4 it seemed to prefer. It would be taller than Izuku if it did, but not by much. Still intimidating though. The most hostile-looking one that always seemed to be glaring in his direction was the orange lizard-like alien. Its eyes were a striking yellow, and it reminded Izuku of a dragonborn or lizard man from video games back home. He hoped it couldn't breathe fire like in the games too. The sheep-like alien was actually pretty cute. If they made a plush toy modeled after it back on Earth, it would be an instant hit. Izuku wondered if its pink wool was as soft as it looked. Its face was flatter than that of an actual sheep's, but its eyes were still slightly wide-set, making them seem bigger than they were and adding to the cute stuffed animal-like quality it had going for it. Moving on to the smaller aliens, one looked similar to a kangaroo or jumping mouse. It couldn't have been much taller than 4 feet, but it was incredibly cute. Where the pink sheep would be coveted by girls, this alien would probably be loved equally by both genders. It was sunflower yellow with black streaks along its back, almost like a baby tapir, and its ears were something like a fennec fox's. Similar in size was the simian. It had the same basic body structure of a spider monkey, but the face was decidedly different. Something similar to a human in structure, but the nose was more cat-like and its eyes were perfectly round and completely black. That, and it had 4 of them, which was somewhere between oddly cute and extremely horrifying. Izuku would settle on cute for his sanity. The final member of their little cell was the smallest of them all, a slight thing standing at about 3 feet tall that looked like the perfect blend of bird and bat. Its body structure was very bat-like, but it had the softest-looking feathers on its wings, which rested closed on its back away from its taloned arms. It was a soft, snowy white and had striking red eyes. Looking at it gave Izuku the strong urge to protect. On that note, his staring was probably making them feel uncomfortable. Tearing his gaze away, Izuku slowly scooted back to his place against the wall, away from the group and closer to the electrified bars. He was surprised when a small lump joined him. There, leaning up against his lap and staring right into his eyes was the white batbird. Izuku was surprised, and after turning to look back at the group he'd just left, it seemed that they were too. Hello. The creature scrunched its face in what Izuku hoped was a smile of some kind before it started chattering in a language he couldn't understand. I'm sorry, I don't speak common. It also seemed confused, but it started talking again, probably repeating what it said before, not that Izuku could understand it. Another noise caught his attention though, and on instinct he gently pushed the white alien behind himself, staring out into the hallway. The guards were coming. The staring was unnerving, but Aizawa subtly warned everyone with common sign language to remain still and not make any sudden movements. It may have been docile, but it was still an unknown that had just woken up. It soon seemed to realize it was making them uncomfortable though and moved back to the place it had been sitting at the day before. Aizawa would have felt bad for being so cautious if Eri hadn't immediately followed and invaded its personal space. He tried to whisper for her to come back, but she ignored him. Before he could grab her with one of his tails, she'd already caught its attention. It seemed confused before it spoke to her in some guttural foreign tongue. I'm Eri, what's your name? The Terran seemed confused, but indulgent as it responded, probably telling her that it couldn't understand her. Eri was too young to understand that not all species spoke common yet. I don't understand. Is that your name? It's very long. Aizawa nearly had a heart attack when it seemed to shift its focus from attentive to assertive, muscles tensing when it moved to touch Eri, but its motions were smooth and gentle, placing Eri between it and the cell bars. A few moments later Aizawa could hear the footsteps too. There was no cart and Aizawa growled lowly in his throat. They were here for more feathers. He should have expected this. Eri's flight feathers had grown back in, so it was inevitable that they would return. Eri was young, so it only took about 1 lunar rotation for her feathers to grow in fully, but it didn't hurt any less whenever they were plucked. Deathfly sprite feathers are beautiful in the right lighting. Most of the time they seem white, but in the suns of their home planet, their feathers shine in iridescent rainbows. There are rumors that say powdered feathers can restore youth to those that consume them, but most of the time deathfly feathers are used to make illegal shimmering jewelry. Aizawa wished that he could do more than just growl, but everyone in the cell had learned the hard way that they stood no chance unarmed against the guards and would only end up in pain afterwards. Their pain hurt Eri more than it hurt them. She blamed herself for their injuries, and they couldn't even lie that they were fine because she could feel that they weren't. Aizawa hoped that it would be over quickly. Eri whimpered when the guards came into view, 2 Reiks each holding a pair of pliers. The Terran glanced down at Eri before laser focusing back on the guards. It shifted so that Eri was more hidden behind it. Interesting. The freaking Death Worlder is guarding it. What do we do? I mean, are we sure it's really a Death Worlder? Sure, it matches the description for that savage race that fended off the strays, but look at it. No claws, no fangs, heck, it's so small it looks like it would be out for a whole solar cycle if we shocked it. I don't care what you say. Until I know it's completely safe, I'm not getting within arm's reach of that thing. Fine, fine, suit yourself, I'll just take your cut of the pay for this. The Terran tensed as the cage door was opened, the hesitant guard standing just outside. Then it stood to its full height. Was it always so large? Aizawa had thought that it stood up abruptly when it very first woke up in their cell, but it must have just been sitting. It was twice the height it had ever been around them. Though looking back it must have not wanted to seem intimidating. The gray cell clothes did a great job of concealing just how small it had been contorting itself. It was almost as tall as Bakugo now. Its arms poked out from the sides of its gray top, curling its fingers as if it had claws. Though its teeth looked flat and blunt, the snarl on its face still sent terror ripping down Azawa's spine. Definitely a predator. The Reich guard also seemed to hesitate before steeling himself and stepping forward, holding out his electrified baton. The Terran showed no signs of backing down. Azawa would have to witness the moment this child's strange sentient learned why the guard should be avoided, especially when armed. It caught the baton with its hand as the guard swung, then flinched and hissed at the shock it received, but still it didn't back down. Azawa could hardly believe what he'd just witnessed. Even he would have gone down with a hit like that. Most creatures, sentient or not, would crumple to the ground, muscles spasming uncontrollably after getting hit with a baton, let alone catching and holding one for more than a glancing moment. But the Terran hardly looked fazed. The Reich swung once more, but the Terran was prepared for the shock this time, grabbing the baton and somehow ignoring the charge running through it, attempting to pull the electrified stick away from the guard. The Reich kept its hold on the baton, moving into the swing and grabbing the Terran by its shoulders with his upper set of arms. Azawa didn't know what the Reich intended to do now. His two lower arms were full, holding the feather pliers and baton respectively, and now his two upper arms were grappling the Death Worlder. The guard tried to push the Terran down using his superior height, but the Terran didn't budge. He thought the Terran was a bit bulky as it used him as a pillow last night, but it was obvious now that this creature was built with some fairly defined muscles. Before the guard could pull his arms back to try and change tactics, the Terran turned its head and locked its jaws around the arm on its right shoulder, a sickening crunch following right after. The Reich began to shriek and try to pull away, but the Terran didn't allow it to leave for some reason. The guard was pleading uselessly now, hoping that it might understand some common, but only when the Terran violently shook the still buzzing baton did the guard understand and release his grip. The Terran opened its jaw as soon as the baton went slack in its grasp and the guard ran out, cradling his very obviously broken arm. There was purple lining the rim of the Terran's mouth and Azawa swore that the Reich's exoskeleton had been near bitten through, but the guards didn't stick around for too long after, rushing out of the hallway and leaving everyone in deafening silence. The Terran was breathing heavily, the baton now held properly in its hand and turned off for the moment. Ares' distressed whine was what broke the silence, and just like that the Terran was in action, dropping the baton to the ground and scooping Ares up into its arms like she weighed nothing. It cradled her head into its chest and began to lightly bounce in a rocking motion, murmuring things in its strange language in a soothing tone. It realized that its mouth was covered in blood after a few moments and used the inner neckline of its top to wipe it away with a disgusted look, but the moment couldn't last and out of nowhere the snarling expression was back. The Terran was precise in its actions, gently setting Ares down near the group and pushing her towards Azawa. Then it very deliberately held the baton, handle side out, to the group. Bakko was the one to take it, moving himself to stand beside Azawa now that he was armed. The Terran then stepped forward, blocking the path leading to the corner where everyone was huddled. There was shouting as a larger group of guards approached. Izuku observed as always when he heard the guards approaching. There were no wheels this time, so this wasn't a meal delivery. He heard the little white alien whimper before he saw the pliers, and then he was livid. He could put two and two together and the little thing he was protecting didn't have long enough feathers to fly, so that meant they were probably being stolen as they grew in. He hoped that his glare would keep the cockroach-looking guards outside, and it seemed to work on one of them, but the other one arrogantly opened the door and stepped inside waving a black stick at him. For the first time since he'd woken up, Izuku stood to his feet. It felt strange after nearly a full day crouched, but he'd spent longer sitting and laying before. His height made the guard hesitate, but it didn't take long before it steeled itself to attack. It didn't swing very hard, but Izuku wasn't expecting the shock either. He probably should have, considering how he could sometimes hear the cell bars buzzing in dead silence. These pirates seemed to like electricity. Izuku was more prepared for the second swing. The charge was annoying, but nothing he couldn't handle after how many times he'd shocked himself building robots and computers in preparation for the space program. He tried to pull the stick towards himself, but the guard followed, wrapping small pincer-like hands on his shoulder. He would be taking that stick now, thank you very much, so he did the only thing he could while holding the still stinging weapon with both hands. He turned his face and bit its arm. He was surprised that it gave way as easily as a crab claw. He had to stop himself from biting all the way through because that would be gross. This was a warning. A very painful, disgusting warning. The thing screamed but still didn't let go of the baton. One wiggle to let it know his intentions was all it took, and as soon as he opened his mouth, the cockroach was halfway to the cell door. Both guards left quickly, and it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop for several moments. Then the little bird bat whimpered and Izuku latched his focus onto that. It was pure instinct that had him scooping the little creature into his arms, bouncing it like a human toddler. It's okay, you're okay, everything's okay, okay? You're not hurt, you're okay. He belatedly hoped that it was a child. This would be embarrassing to explain if it were an adult of its species, but it didn't seem to mind being held, at least, latching onto his gray shirt. Why was there purple? Oh God, the blood. He was so hyped up on adrenaline he barely tasted it, but it must have been all over his face. It was disgustingly bitter and he was glad to wipe it off, but it wasn't much longer before he could hear the guards returning. Izuku had to steel himself for this. Of course there would be consequences for his actions. He just hoped that this wouldn't be the end of his story. He tried not to startle the others as he gently pushed the little white alien towards them. They were accepted easily enough, the others shielding them within their mass, and Izuku made the decision to arm the group. They didn't seem to want to fight the guards, and it was probably because, again quoting Yagi, humans are space orcs. Humans seem to be stronger than most other species, so their reluctance to fight a known threat made sense. Izuku would be fine using his bare hands. If worse came to worst, he would start biting again. That seemed effective at least. He held out the baton to the group, and it wasn't surprising that the perpetually glowering lizard alien took it. Izuku hoped that he was just misreading its facial expressions, but it looked so angry that he couldn't help but see it that way. The guards came into view soon enough, and Izuku took his place standing in front of the group. The guards that came this time were varied, but one was the toad-like alien that had sniped him with a dart back at the pod. He bared his teeth and hissed at it in particular. Though not a usual human warning, Izuku knew it was one of the universally accepted sounds for "stay away." The guard paid no heed, getting ready to shoot at him again. Another guard stopped it. There seemed to be some kind of argument between them for a bit, but eventually they seemed to come to a decision. They weren't aiming at him anymore. Their gazes were locked on those in the corner. Izuku wouldn't let them. He held out his arms, growling as they took the shot. It hit his shoulder and he glared despite his now doubling vision. Time seemed to slow as they stood at a standoff. Any time one of them would move, Izuku would make a hiss or growl, but then he fell to one knee and then the other. The cell door was opened and he raised his head to glare, not remembering when he'd lowered it. He was out cold before the guards reached him. No one could deny that this was a Terran Deathworlder any longer. Any doubts held by Aizawa, his students, or the guards were erased as soon as it stood to its full height and savagely fought the Reich invading its space. And yet despite its terrifying strength, Aizawa couldn't find it in himself to fear it anymore. It had held Eri so gently. Its face had been contorted in obvious concern while it rocked her like a child, a stark difference to the fury it displayed before. She was a child, of course, but the Terran would have no way of really knowing that. Her size must have triggered some kind of parental instinct within it. Even Bakko could no longer deny that this alien was dangerous, definitely capable of guarding its home planet from an invading force given enough numbers. It also probably earned respect in the Dragit's book when it handed him a weapon. It knew it was most likely getting itself into a tougher fight but had still crippled itself to arm the group and fight barehanded. That in and of itself would earn him a high standing in Dragit etiquette. A larger group of guards rushed into the holding area, staring into their cell with apprehension. They had the Fogget with them, probably a precaution to take out everyone in the cell without having to physically fight them to retrieve their baton and pluck Eri's feathers as intended. Aizawa hated smart criminals. One of the guards stopped the Fogget before it could spit a dart at the Terran. Wait, what if it dodges? Then I try again, now let me take the shot. It's standing in front of the others, you idiot. You said it yourself, the dose you're about to give it would probably kill any of them. Well, what do you expect me to do about that? There was a slight pause before they made a suggestion that made Aizawa's blood boil. What if you pretend to shoot at the others? The Reich swore that the Deathworlder was protecting the Deathfly sprite, and it's standing protectively in front of the rest of the group. It probably pack-bonded with them, so if we threaten the group it should try to take the hit. I don't have all day, so let's get to it then. You lot play dumb and don't warn the Terran that we're not trying to shoot you. You will die if you take this dart, so no funny business. Stand down, return the baton, and let us take the Terran for modifications peacefully. When we return, we'll take those feathers and be on our way. Eri whimpered, and it seemed to spur the protective urges in the Terran again as it snarled. As much as Azawa's fur bristled at the idea of them modifying the human, he knew that he couldn't risk his or his students' lives to a lethal dose of Fogget neurotoxin. It made his skin crawl as he forced himself to do nothing. Their plan worked like a charm, tricking the Terran into taking a dart it didn't know was actually intended for them. It was a painfully slow process, watching as the Terran fought to stay awake. Azawa's nose crinkled as he smelled just how much toxin was delivered in that dose. But the Terran was eventually downed and Bakko was forced to return the baton peacefully or also receive a dose of neurotoxin. Eri was extremely distressed when the Terran was dragged out of the cell, but Na was quick to comfort her. About half a cycle later, the Terran was returned wearing a muzzle with a grate big enough to fit the ration pellets through, but not much else. Eri's newly grown flight feathers were harvested and the Terran began to stir just in time for the final meal of the day. It groaned as the squeaky cartwheel woke it, and it sat up abruptly when it realized where it was. Azawa would never mistake its sitting for standing ever again. The guard with the rations flinched in surprise when the Terran locked its eyes on him and delivered their tray quickly, leaving the prisoner's hallway with haste. The Terran seemed to relax and no one was expecting Eri to bolt straight into the Terran. "Thank you." The Terran was startled, but thankfully calmed quickly, gently petting the top of Eri's head. It was probably something Terrans did to groom each other with what little hair they did possess. Its facial features were relaxed as it murmured quietly to the deathfly sprite. After taking a few moments to reassure Eri, the Terran turned its attention to the muzzle it was wearing. It wouldn't be able to remove it, Azawa had been placed in one for training before. It was stifling, but one learned to deal with it after a while. The leather was sturdy or it could forcibly pull open the padlock from behind its head. That works too. Seriously, what was up with this species? Azawa could hear the snapping of the lock mechanisms as the Terran pulled it apart. With the lock gone, the muzzle slid off its face, but it didn't discard the pieces like Azawa thought it would. No, it placed the device on the ground next to where it sat as it finally grabbed the ration tray. It seemed to hunch in on itself as it eyed Na's nightly yanjine. It hesitantly held up one finger again, signaling that it wanted another piece. Na was quick to agree, trying her best to motion that the Terran could take the slice. After today, it definitely deserved it. It was as gentle as ever when taking the fruit slice, and as with every meal so far, it pushed its own rations at the rest of the group. Eri opted to stay with the Terran, taking her ration and leaning against it as she ate. The Terran didn't seem to mind, and after the protective streak it showed today, Azawa would be a fool to try and get in between them. After the Terran finished its portion, it seemed to play with Eri a bit. She wanted to feed it, but it only took the ration in its hand and made strange noises while it waved the pellet around, gently placing it at Eri's mouth. She obediently ate the pellets with a giggle, and all subsequent attempts at giving the Terran some of her rations were met in a similar way. The guard that came to retrieve their trash flinched even harder when it saw that the Terran was glaring at it without its muzzle, but dutifully collected their tray and left for the night quickly. Only after they were gone and the lights were dimmed did the Terran speak again, this time deliberately. It turned to Eri, placed a hand on its chest and said one word. "Izuku." Izuku woke with a start, the faint squeaking wheel of the food cart reminding him that he wasn't at the station and he'd fought against the aliens that captured him. He instinctively glared at the guard bringing their food and was proudly vindicated when it flinched. Good, he was tired of being bullied by everything around him. The delicious fruit was there again, but he had a stupid metal cage around his face. Probably because he bit that one guard earlier. He didn't regret it. A little white rocket slammed into him, and he was quick to try and reassure the little alien that was now noticeably missing several of its longer feathers. He did his best to keep the discontent off his face. After making sure it was okay and nothing else seemed damaged, Izuku felt out the thing on his face. "Okay, so it had a thick strap that wouldn't give, but there was some sort of metal on the back of his head. Okay, so those two halves could pull apart and, there was some kind of small padlock holding everything shut. Izuku once had to pull open a combination lock someone placed on his school locker. This thing was only a bit bigger than a cheap diary lock, so even if it were a bit stronger he could just… and he's free. Despite wanting nothing more than to yeet the cage across the cell, Izuku knew that he might be able to use the parts to make some sort of lockpick later, but first, food. It was day 2 of his capture and all Izuku had eaten was one slice of an oversized alien orange. The little bat bird that now refused to leave his side could undoubtedly hear his growling stomach from where it was, but he ignored it to hopefully ask the group for another slice of the lorange. Luckily, the sheep seemed eager to share, so he gathered his slice and slid the tray over after the small white alien took its own portion. It tried to feed him, and it would have been the most endearing thing if he could actually eat their pellets. He distracted them by playing Food Airplane instead. The alien was delighted despite not knowing the context of his actions. He was just glad they seemed so joyful after everything that happened earlier. His lorange slice was gone before he knew it, and he hoped that the guards would notice his dilemma and give him a granola bar or something before he actually starved. Only after the last guard left and the lights were turned off for the night did Izuku truly relax. It was now or never. The others in his cell were too nervous to initiate first contact, so he would have to do it. Turning to the alien that showed him the least amount of fear, Izuku placed a hand on his chest and clearly pronounced his name. Izuku. He patted his hand there a few more times, repeating himself. After a few moments, recognition seemed to flash on the alien's face and it placed its small hand on his chest, repeating after him. Izuku. 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 He smiled with a closed mouth at their enthusiasm, remembering that some aliens found smiles with teeth to be threatening and nodding, hoping that they understood the gesture. He then placed his hand gently on their chest. After a moment, they responded, Eri, Eri, Eri. Izuku smiled again. He really hoped this was a child because he couldn't imagine it being an adult, though the thought of a young child being trapped here wasn't pleasant either, disregarding his own situation of course. Izuku was pulled out of his thoughts as Eri gestured to the others, calling out their names. Izuku pronounced each one patiently, and as he said them each member seemed to come out of their shell to finish introductions. Their names were all so varied and it was actually kind of fun to try and pronounce them all. He would ignore the fact that they seemed slightly uncomfortable. He would be too if the alien that fought off an armed guard suddenly turned around and tried to act friendly. There was some chatter as Izuku went back and forth with the group, repeating names over and over before the panther, Azawa, chuffed like Izuku had seen tigers do on YouTube, gathering their attention. It said another foreign word and Eri was polite enough to pretend to fall asleep to teach him what the word meant. Okay, so maybe he could pick up some common before he returned to society. Azawa took their place on the ground as the cuddle pile built itself, and Izuku was surprised that they lifted their arm in invitation again. Without giving himself enough time to second-guess his actions, Izuku picked up the discarded mouth guard and sunk to the floor, rolling into Azawa and settling back into the position he'd fallen asleep in the previous night. He didn't want the guards to take away the cage, so he placed it against the wall, hiding it as best as he could behind his hair and hoping that Azawa wouldn't mind as long as it didn't touch him. He wasn't very tired after having just woken up earlier, but he didn't want to mess up his sleep schedule too much either. Eri, rather than joining the cuddle pile like before, forced their way in between Izuku's arms, talons clutching at the gray fabric over his chest. Okay, this was fine, but Eri was too exposed like this. Before, Izuku was content to face the cell's doors with everyone else behind him, but Eri had proven to be a target now. It would be awkward to face Azawa as they slept, but it would keep Eri just a bit safer. They seemed to like it when he started gently preening at the feathers on their head and fell asleep fairly quickly. Izuku fell asleep himself when Azawa started to purr again. That was one nice thing in this situation at least. It was most definitely sentient. Azawa had known this for a while now. It didn't act like an animal, wild or domesticated, but it was so quiet most of the time that Azawa hadn't been sure that it could speak before. It seemed like Eri was the one to get it to open up. Maybe it recognized that she was trying to introduce herself earlier? At any rate, the Terran shortened its introductions to just names, which was clever with the language barrier in place. Eri picked up on it quickly and they started to go back and forth. Then she drew its attention to everyone else. Azawa, Denki, Na, Bakko, Siro. Most of his students froze at being called out, but the Terran kept its movements calm as it addressed them. Azawa. Azawa inclined his head, replying in kind. Izuku. 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 Azawa repressed a shudder when it not only mimicked his name first try but inclined its head in the same way he had just a few moments before. It quickly shifted its gaze to its next target though, zeroing in on Denki. Denki. Azawa could hear the slight popping spark as the thunky startled. He inclined his head and managed to keep the stammer out of his voice for the most part in response. Izuku. Izuku nodded their head and moved on, probably seeing how nervous it made his student. Na. Na smiled in the way that her people do, also nodding her assent, excited to finally talk to the Terran. Zuku. Izuku. 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 It had pulled its own face into some kind of smile. It was similar enough to some other species, and Azawa hoped that this wasn't just an assumption on his part. This almost felt like the first day of school again. Introductions always took a while due to how varied the languages could be on some planets. Common was meant to be as universally accessible as possible, but included gestures and signs for those species that couldn't communicate otherwise. It looked stupid sometimes. Azawa hated whenever he had to dance around while speaking, but it was a necessary evil that everyone had to deal with. So far though this Terran seemed like an excellent mimic, which was both terrifying and impressive. Bakko. There was a long pause as the Dragot seemed to weigh his options on not replying, but to Azawa's surprise and relief Bakko slumped his shoulders, giving Izuku his full attention before he replied. Izuku. It was curt and precise. The Terran didn't seem to mind and just nodded, moving along. Siro. The Senki startled at that. Oh stars, that's creepy. Oh stars, that's creepy? Siro quickly corrected the misunderstanding. Siro. Siro. Izuku? The Terran nodded, a slightly confused look on its face. And wasn't that just something? The Terran didn't seem to have any trouble with any of their names. Azawa wondered why they developed such good mimicry skills and hoped it wasn't a hunting thing. He allowed for a few more moments of back and forth banter before he decided that he and his students needed their rest. Sleep. It only took the one word for his students to start getting ready for bed. Hopefully the Terran also understood. Eri helped by acting the word out. After getting comfortable himself, Azawa lifted one of his arms again in invitation. Before taking its place, the Terran shifted the muzzle it wore earlier so that it was against the wall near its head, adjusting in such a way that it would be slightly hidden from view while outside of the cell. Azawa didn't know why the Terran was keeping the muzzle, but he couldn't ask about it, not that he would question it if he could actually communicate with them either way. Eri was quick to worm her way into the Death Worlder's embrace after it had settled, and if Azawa didn't already know that it was attached to her, he would have protested the blatant invasion of its space. As it was, the Terran didn't seem very comfortable after Eri had latched herself to its top. It became tense and Azawa couldn't figure out why until it turned around to face him. So it was more protective than he thought. Usually the Terran faced the front, probably to keep an eye on anything that might enter their cell, but Eri's safety seemed more important than that, so it was using itself to shield her in a way. It was surprisingly domestic for a Death Worlder that Azawa knew could tear someone limb from limb. He could tell that the Terran had held itself back from severing that Reich's arm. It almost seemed surprised at its own strength. It was hard to imagine as he watched the Terran gently preen at Eri's feathers, but he'd seen it in action firsthand. She still felt safe enough around it to fall asleep quickly, but even after she was asleep, it didn't stop its preening. Azawa couldn't help but purr while he watched it care for her. Their hopes of getting rescued by UA grew slimmer and slimmer with every passing solar rotation, and their chances of rescue from the HPSC had already been low to begin with, but with this Terran on their side, then maybe, just maybe, their chances of escape were higher than the near impossible odds they had been before. Only time would tell. Izuku was absolutely sure that everyone could hear his stomach now. The sound of the food cart woke him up again, and after the tray was slid in, all he had was a water container to his name. He tried not to look too disappointed as he drank to have at least something in his stomach. Eri was now attached to his hip and sat in his lap as she ate her ration. Na, Denki, and Siro were all giving him strange looks as they ate. Na seemed to be the bravest one out of the group as they left the others and approached Izuku. He stared at them curiously until they crouched in front of him and forced a ration pellet into his hand. They were worried about him. It would be sweet if their food didn't smell like perfume and shampoo. Na started to talk at him, miming the eating motion. Izuku smiled awkwardly at them, shaking his head to hopefully get his point across. He tried to hand the pellet back, but they wouldn't accept it. Bakko barked something at them and Azawa also said something, but Na pouted and still looked pleadingly at Izuku. After a few moments even Eri spoke up. Izuku didn't know what was said, but he could at least tell that it was on his behalf. Defeated but still not fully undeterred, Na held up one finger, much like Izuku had with their fruit every night. One piece. They wanted him to eat just one piece. Izuku never had been good at avoiding peer pressure, especially when he hardly had any friends growing up to begin with, so his resolve crumbled quickly. It didn't smell like a harsh chemical cleaner like bleach or Clorox, just hand soap. He'd eaten soap before as a child, and though it was gross it didn't kill him. He hoped that it would also be the case here. Na's eyes seemed to sparkle as they smiled when Izuku held up one finger back. Izuku's own face was scrunched up into an awkward smile of his own as he did so. He was already sweating and he hadn't even eaten it yet. He was screwed, wasn't he? Maybe it wasn't as bad as he remembered? Izuku took an experimental sniff at the pellet gifted to him. Yup. Nope, this would be like licking air freshener, wouldn't it? Sucking it up, Izuku threw it into his mouth, chewing a few times before deciding that chewing was a bad idea and using the rest of his water to wash it down like bad medicine. He couldn't help but stick his tongue out in disgust afterwards. Eri placed their hand on his arm in worry, but he was quick to school his features into a smile and murmur quiet reassurances to the little bat bird. They didn't seem convinced. Na was satisfied though and went back to their little group, chattering away and finishing the rest of their ration. Nothing happened for a while after, but Izuku could feel that whatever was in that pellet wasn't settling well in his stomach. Eri was content to play with his fingers and babble things that Izuku couldn't understand until lunch was delivered. Everyone gathered their portions and Izuku resolutely ignored the tray and the group of aliens eating this time around. He didn't make it until dinner before his body decided that it did not like what he'd ingested earlier and it was time to expel it. Finally moving from his spot against the wall made him surprisingly motion sick, but he was still gentle with Eri as he nudged her off his lap and quickly crawled to the bathroom area. If Izuku was thankful for one thing, it was the fact that even these alien prison cells had working plumbing, though theirs was more air-based than water-based and their bidet was uncomfortable to get used to. It was only a small area in the back right corner with a 3-foot-long half-wall for some privacy, but it wasn't tall enough to easily hide from the guards. Usually everyone looked away for the sake of privacy, but it seemed as if all eyes were on him as he started to violently retch into the square bowl. There was nothing but bile and water, and it was obvious that Izuku was able to digest some of the pellet, but there were dried plant bits that had been pressed into them that were now visible in the mess. Eri of course had run over in concern, tugging at his clothes in worry. He tried to reassure her, but it was hard to do so when all his body wanted to do was dry heave. There was nothing left, and yet it persisted. If anyone ever tried to peer pressure him into doing drugs, he would forever remember the time he was peer pressured by an alien to eat literal poison and force himself to grow some backbone. It only really lasted a few minutes, but he still felt nauseous afterwards. There was no way he was going to crawl all the way back to his usual spot against the wall on the other side of the room, so he pressed the button to empty the toilet and slumped heavily against the privacy wall. Eri whimpered beside him, talons digging into his gray poncho. Izuku made sure that his face and hands were clean before starting to preen Eri, trying to reassure them that he would be okay. He could already feel that this would just be a bad spell of nausea and nothing life-threatening. Sparing a glance at the others in the cell, he probably looked like he was dying with how worried they all seemed. He tried to reassure them too, smiling a bit and trying to make a light hand motion to wave off their concern. They probably wouldn't understand a thumbs up, would they? He was just going to nap. Yeah, a nap sounded good. He'd probably feel better by dinner, and then he could have another slice of the l'orange they'd deliver. It probably wasn't a good idea to eat something so acidic after throwing up, but food was food. At least they probably wouldn't try to force him to eat anything else again. Na made it her goal to get Izuku to eat. It had already been nearly 3 full solar rotations and all they ever had was a bit of her yanjine and some water. She complained to everyone in their group except for Bakugo who refused to get involved, but they were all too chicken to help her out, even if everyone agreed that Izuku shouldn't be starving themselves. Have fun getting your hand bit off. Na only glared at Bakugo's snide comment before approaching Izuku. Okay, she had their attention, that was good. It wasn't like this was the only predator in the universe that her natural defense mechanism probably wouldn't work on or anything, no need to be nervous. Before she could stop herself, Na forced a ration into Izuku's hand. They seemed to understand what she was trying to do, but still refused to eat the pellet. Na, never one to be deterred easily, started to exaggerate eating motions, encouraging Izuku to just eat the stupid ration. They still tried to let her down easy, trying and failing to return it to her. Give it a rest, it doesn't want to eat. Don't try to force the Terran to do something it doesn't want to, nah. There are many things we don't know about them, like their eating habits. What you're doing could be disrespectful. Bakugo Na could ignore, but Aizawa had a point and his words were a thinly veiled order for her to stop outwardly pestering Izuku. Well, there was nothing stopping her from begging them to eat with her expression alone. Izuku had an uncomfortable habit of maintaining direct, unbroken eye contact, but Na forced herself to keep her own gaze locked on. If she gave in first, then they would probably never eat. Eri surprised her by piping up with her own opinion. They don't want to eat them. I don't know why, because they're hungry, but they don't want to eat the rations. Okay, Na had one last trick and then she would give up for now. Mimicking Izuku's actions at dinner, she held up one finger. Maybe, just maybe, she could convince them to eat one ration. Just one. Na nearly leapt with joy when they complied, though they seemed to struggle to get it down. Maybe Terrans only ate fresh foods? They looked like predators because of their eyes, but Izuku ate her fruit and had flat teeth. Did Terrans only eat fruit then? Was it a texture thing? Na dutifully returned to her group after Izuku ate at her request and promptly decided to stop hurting her brain by imagining what Terran culture was like. Izuku seemed a bit paler during lunch and refused to look at any of the other pellets. For it to starve itself so thoroughly, they must have really tasted terrible. Na didn't push the issue again, but it wasn't until a bit later that the truth revealed itself. Eri had grown quieter as the day progressed, something that Na hadn't quite noticed until she stopped speaking completely. Eri was usually quiet, but the Terran had been able to really bring her out of her shell somehow. Even if it had failed to protect her, it had been more successful than their entire group combined when trying to stop the guards and had even gotten off with fewer injuries for its efforts. It was obvious that Izuku was now a protector in Eri's eyes, especially if she could feel their emotions during the whole ordeal. Even Na could tell that they were protective of the deathfly sprite. After Eri stopped talking completely, Na looked over to see a slightly nervous look on her face. Glancing over to Aizawa, she could also see that he had been keeping tabs in the Terran's direction and did not like what he was seeing. Izuku was even more pale than before and seemed to be staring off into the distance, swallowing reflexively every now and again. With no warning, Eri was moved off of Izuku's lap and they lurched away from the wall. They wobbled dangerously at first, but were able to make it to the toilet before puking. It was loud and sounded painful. Na's stomach dropped. Poison. The Terrans couldn't eat the rations because they were toxic to them. Izuku? Izuku, are you gonna be okay? Please don't die, Izuku. Eri was both physically and emotionally attached to the Terran and could probably feel its condition worsening as time passed. That's why she'd grown so quiet. It was all Na's fault. Distressed, Eri turned to them. Please, he feels sick. Can you help him? I'm sorry. The pained look on Aizawa's face was answer enough, and the Terran probably couldn't even hear them over its violent episode. Izuku seemed to calm down after a little while, thankfully, but still looked worse for wear afterwards. They still did their best to clean up and reassure Eri, as if they weren't the one that needed comforting at the moment. After taking care of Eri, Izuku looked back to the rest of the group. They then had the gall to look sheepish as they tried to wave away any concern. It was hard not to worry when they then proceeded to slump against the wall and promptly pass out. Was this it? Was it dying? Were those gestures its last? No one was saying anything, but Na knew that this was all her fault. The Terran was still asleep when dinner arrived. Aizawa chose then to address the guards. The Death Worlder can't eat ration pellets. One of them scoffed at him. Those are designed to fit all species universally. Sure, our supply may be a bit expired, but the nutrients in them are still good. Look, it hasn't eaten them since it arrived. Today we were able to convince it to eat one because we were worried it was starving itself. It became violently sick and is now sleeping against the wall. I'm not even sure if it'll wake up to tell you the truth. The guards observed Izuku for a few moments and Aizawa really tried to hammer in the thought. Check the ship's septic tank if you don't believe me. If you find its vomit, you'll see that it's clear aside from one poorly digested ration. After a few moments of deliberation, the guards nodded. If it makes it through the night, we'll bring a tasting platter for breakfast. Aizawa nodded, realizing that this was going to be the best they were going to get. The guards finished delivering food to the rest of the prisoners and left. Eri refused to leave Izuku's side and Na didn't eat her yanjine. Izuku woke up with a pounding headache, but at least he wasn't nauseous anymore. He groaned as he blearily looked around. Oh, Eri was still clinging to his chest. He couldn't have been out for that long if the lights were still on. Oh, there they went. Dinner must have just ended then. At least his eyes weren't irritated anymore. Izuku stroked Eri's head to try and calm them. The poor thing was so tense. Na approached him soon after, holding out a whole peeled lorange in offering. Izuku couldn't help but laser focus on the fruit. The thought of his one dinner slice was the only thing that kept him going whenever he thought about food now. He wondered why the fruit was peeled, but then realized that they must have saved it from dinner. The guards took away their trays and trash at the end of their meal times. Izuku didn't think it would be a huge deal if the lorange peel was missing, but Na most likely just wanted to make sure all of the trash was taken away. They probably had no idea when Izuku would wake up either, so they'd peeled the fruit and just held it waiting for him. It was a very kind gesture, especially considering that there obviously wasn't enough food being given to them already and Na had to hold off on eating something as tantalizing as the lorange while they waited. Like with earlier, Na forced the food into Izuku's grasp, but instead of sticking around this time they ran back to the group. Were they giving him the whole thing? Didn't they need to eat this? On that first night they seemed terrified that Izuku would eat it. The others were concerned too, but it was obvious that if the guards were willing to provide these from Na, then they were essential to their diet. Izuku cradled Eri with one arm as he stood, holding the lorange in his other hand before walking over to the group. Na was obviously trying to avoid eye contact with him, but he wouldn't let them ignore him for something like this. He tried to sound stern but not aggressive. He didn't want to scare them after all. Na. They instinctively looked over when their name was called. Sitting down cross-legged before the group, Izuku was able to safely let Eri go to use both of his hands to tear the lorange in half, offering one of them to Na. They shook their head at the offer, refusing to take it. Izuku frowned. Now the roles were reversed, but Na needed this more than him. Na. The sheep-like alien had looked away again, but turned to face Izuku as he called their name. Carefully, he peeled away one slice, holding up one finger briefly before holding it out. Na huffed out a light laugh and accepted the piece. Izuku smiled at them and they seemed to relax some. They were probably feeling guilty about earlier. Izuku wasn't mad. They couldn't have known that their food would make him sick. After Na accepted their slice, Izuku moved back to his usual spot in the cell, savoring the smell of the lorange before shoving nearly the whole half of the fruit he'd shared a slice with Na from into his mouth. He didn't care to look to see what the others thought of this impulsive action. He just focused on enjoying having a mouthful of juicy goodness. He ate the other half 2 pieces at a time and was sad when it was gone, but was still more sated than he had been since arriving. Na probably wouldn't be able to share that much of her fruit with him moving forward, but Izuku hoped that he would at least get more than just one slice from now on too. After digesting for just a bit, he turned to the group settling in for the night. Aizawa's raised arm invitation was easily accepted and Eri seemed to calm down after they realized that Izuku was really okay now. Their death grip hadn't lightened on his shirt in the slightest, but it was easy enough to shift them into a good sleeping position as he got comfortable. One thing was sure, Izuku was certainly getting more sleep here than if he'd started classes back at the station. To Azawa's relief, the Terran woke up just in time for everyone to see before bed. It looked groggy, but had more color in its face than earlier. Its expression seemed to be contorted in discomfort, but as soon as it registered Eri, it was surprisingly good at concealing its expression and tending to her. Eri had kept a stress grip on the Terran's top since it fell unconscious, and Azawa was glad that it wasn't trying to pry her off. Na had long since made her decision to share her Yanjin with the Death Worlder, and Azawa was only allowing it because she had to remove the guilt she couldn't seem to shake, and if all went well tomorrow then the Terran wouldn't need to take her fruit anymore. It instinctively looked up when it heard her approaching footsteps, and Azawa could see the moment its gaze locked onto the fruit. It stared intensely and was probably salivating if the reflexive swallowing Azawa could see from his position meant anything. Na was quick in handing the fruit over, scuttling back over to the group afterwards, but now the Terran looked confused. It looked from the fruit and then back to Na before deliberating. It didn't seem to like the conclusion it came to. Azawa was surprised at how much strength it seemed to have after being so sick earlier, but it had regained its lost balance and was able to stand while still holding Eri before walking right over to them. It would always be unnerving to see it stand to its full height after getting used to its sitting position, but it didn't last long, the Terran taking a seat within arm's reach of his students. Na. The Deep turned her head and locked eyes with the Terran. To everyone's surprise, the Terran deliberately split the Yanjin in half and offered one of the halves to Na. It must have been starving, and yet it was still willing to share that much? Azawa would probably have scarfed down any food offered to him after 3 solar rotations of nothing and felt guilty about it later, but Death Worlders seemed to have a surprising amount of restraint. They couldn't even tell it why Na needed the fruit in the first place, yet it was smart enough to figure out that she did indeed need it. Na could be stubborn though and shook her head in the same way the Terran did earlier when it was refusing to eat the toxic ration pellet she offered. Izuku seemed a bit exasperated at the refusal before getting her attention again. Na. It made one more attempt, holding up one finger and peeling away one slice of the Yanjin. Na snorted and finally accepted the offer. After seeing it so many times, Azawa could confidently say that the expression it was making was a smile, and after Na had her slice it shuffled back over to its usual spot in the cell. The whole world then seemed to fade away for the Terran. It took a long smell of the Yanjin and without warning shoved nearly the entire smaller half into its mouth, one slice falling apart from the rest only to be quickly eaten right after. It resolutely ignored them as it made little contented noises while chewing. The second half was savored a bit more slowly, but one slice at a time didn't seem to be enough when it had more available to it. It was almost funny to watch since the fruit was obviously a bit bigger than the food its mouth had evolved to eat. After the fruit was gone, it just sat against the wall for a bit, stroking Eri's head. When it finally turned to look in their corner, Azawa didn't hesitate to raise his arm in invitation. The Terran wasted no time in picking Eri up and nestling her in between them, settling down for bed. One thing that Azawa couldn't deny was how warm the Terran was. If it weren't so heavy he might have invited it into the cuddle pile, but it could never comfortably lay on top of his students, and he doubted it would be very comfortable at the bottom of the pile. This would just have to do. Almost like clockwork, the sound of the squeaky food cart woke Izuku. He didn't know when the others woke up usually, but they all seemed to be awake enough to eat whenever it arrived. Maybe they were more sensitive to light and woke up when they were turned on for the day? Izuku's mom used to joke that just opening the curtains was never enough for him like in the movies. There was something interesting on the cart today and instead of one tray, 2 were pushed in. The guards stared at Izuku strangely, but didn't comment before moving along. The rations were wrong today, but the tray of assorted items far outweighed the one missing ration cup. Izuku couldn't stop staring at the little piles. No longer afraid of him, the others approached and gathered their portions, moving back to their usual corner to eat afterwards. Izuku looked from the tray to them, not quite understanding what was going on. Bakko huffed in annoyance, catching Izuku's attention before pointing at the tray and then to Izuku. Izuku! Izuku wanted to be completely sure, so he pointed at the tray and then to himself, repeating Bakko's motions. They bobbed their head once before turning away and continuing their meal. Izuku blinked down at the tray as if it would hold the answers to the universe. Did they tell the guards that he was allergic to their pellets while he was out cold yesterday? That was actually really sweet. Not one to waste an opportunity, Izuku took stock of what was available. He wouldn't be touching the raw meat or mixed seeds, but the fact that they were there amongst other options showed that they were trying to find his diet requirements. They could just rummage through his safety pod and throw a granola bar at him assuming they still had the thing, but as long as he would be getting more food soon it didn't really matter. He would save the fruit for later inspection, but there was cooked meat and something similar to bread on the tray. The cooked meat was cut into chunks, but just to be safe Izuku ripped a bigger piece in half. Medium well done, that's acceptable. It didn't smell off and most meat wasn't toxic, unlike plants which came in a wide variety, so it was probably as safe as any other cooked meat could be. The bread smelled really nice actually, and because it wasn't an Earth recipe he couldn't even tell if it was supposed to be stale or not. Ripping it in half, Izuku stuffed most of the cooked meat in between the bread halves. If he had mayo then his sandwich wouldn't be so dry, but real food was amazing to have after so long. Izuku tried to make sure to chew his food thoroughly, but it was difficult with how ravenous he was. He didn't want to throw up after finally getting to eat again. He'd had enough of that yesterday, thank you very much. It was still too soon before the main course was gone. Now for the fruit. There were a few options to choose from, but everything was sliced into a kind of fruit salad. Taking one piece of each item, they each had to pass a sniff and lick test. Luckily everything passed and Izuku began to eat his dessert. Eri's stare caught him off guard, but he couldn't resist that face. After eating a few more pieces, he offered some to them. Eri's eyes went wide when they realized that he was actually sharing with them. They seemed hesitant, but Izuku put on his most convincing smile and pushed a few pieces towards them. Their resolve crumbled quickly and they shoved slices of fruit into their mouth. Izuku couldn't help but laugh at that, slowly taking a few more slices for himself before leaving the rest for Eri. He was full. Like, actually full, and it left him feeling quite happy. He wiped away some fruit juice from Eri's face when they finished and returned the trays to the guards with a smile on his face. If he purposefully smiled with teeth to unnerve them, then that was his business, but his joy was short-lived. Before lunch, the ship shook suddenly. When the gravity shifted, Izuku knew they were landing somewhere. Where were they headed? What was going on? The others seemed worried but not surprised. Not wanting to take his chances, Izuku joined them in their corner. They were at least comfortable enough with him now that this should be fine. Izuku didn't bother to check as he stared past the bars and into the hallway. This didn't bode well. Right on schedule, the squeaky wheel of the food cart woke the Terran. Just as promised, there was a tasting platter ready for it. The guard didn't linger after pushing their trays in, and the Terrans stared curiously at the assortment of foods. To minimize confusion, everyone had agreed to gather their rations and return to the corner, leaving the Terran to peruse its options. It still seemed confused, and to everyone's surprise Bakugo took the lead in explaining the platter. It was simple enough. He caught the Terran's attention, pointed to the tray and then to it, and said their name. Still reluctant, the Terran pointed to the tray and back to itself. At Bakugo's affirmative nod, Izuku began to inspect the items before them. Azawa wasn't surprised when they didn't spare a glance to the assorted seeds. They were a mammal after all, and those were preferred by avians, but they also steered clear of the raw meat, which was mildly surprising. Everything else was fair game, and after inspecting the cooked meat to check its preparation, Izuku wasted no time in stuffing the chunks into the provided bun ration. Not the strangest thing Azawa had ever seen, but for them to recognize the bun as food right away meant that they had something similar back on the Terran death world. They saved the fruit for last, and despite agreeing to let the Terran eat in peace, the deathfly sprite couldn't help but eye the fruit. Izuku was very observant and noticed her after just a few bites. Eri tried to stay strong so that Izuku could eat, but despite this being their first meal in 3 solar rotations, they still were willing to share. Deathfly sprites survive almost solely on fruit, so after having been held captive for so long it was probably irresistible to the young girl. Izuku was generous, saving nearly a third of the assorted fruit for Eri to snack on. They even seemed to enjoy watching her eat, not that Azawa could blame them. Eri almost looked like Izuku had the night before as they gorged on Na's gifted yanjine. The domesticity wasn't meant to last, unfortunately, as not even halfway through the cycle the ship lurched as it prepared to land on some unknown planet. Azawa hoped that they were just refueling or gathering more supplies before moving along, but this had happened a handful of times during their stay already and the chances of that were slim. He at least prayed that they wouldn't be using the Death World. Underground fighting rings could have some nasty competitors, and Izuku obviously had no clue how to tell what creatures to look out for. Izuku was not prepared for the ship to land and huddled with the rest of them in their corner in apprehension. The landing didn't take too long, and it was eerily still until the guards entered the hallway, armed with their batons and restraints. I'm saying that the Death Worlder should have been chosen. Did you see what it did to Skadi's arm? For the last time, that wasn't our call to make. We're still too close to its home territory to draw attention to it, so we have to wait until we get to another system before we can have it fight. I know, I'm just so curious to see what it can really do, you know? Yeah, less talking, more grabbing. To Azawa's relief, the guards opened up the cell directly in front of theirs, taking out the Nriya for today's fight. As terrible as this situation was, Nriyas weren't a sentient species. It was still cruelty, but there was something different about sending an animal to fight versus sending a colonized species into the ring. The Nriya didn't go quietly, but even it knew to follow after it was caught. Those batons were nothing to mess with. Lunch was more tailored after the guards assessed what was and wasn't eaten from the Terran's breakfast tray, and by dinner they will have figured out a meal plan for Izuku. They still shared their fruit with Eri, but Azawa wasn't going to step in and stop them. When the Nriya wasn't back by dinner time, Azawa knew that it wouldn't be returning. He idly wondered if they would try to move Izuku now that there was a free cell again. Izuku didn't like how everyone kept glancing at him after the ship landed. He tensed when the guards walked into the hallway, but they thankfully didn't enter their cell. They instead took out the alien in the cell in front of theirs to drag it off somewhere. Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to know where it was taken. It didn't come back. On the bright side, he was no longer starving. The guards had cracked the code and he now had edible food to eat, though he felt bad that the others still had to eat those disgusting pellets. They didn't seem to mind aside from Eri, but Izuku was happy to share his fruit with them. He didn't even have to ask Na for any of their lorange anymore. They stayed docked wherever they'd landed just for the night, and after their breakfast trays had been collected the ship rumbled back to life, blasting back into space. It was impossible to tell exactly which direction they were going in, not only because there were no windows in their cells but also because Izuku had only felt any motion at all while the ship was either landing or taking off. Everyone knew that something big had happened after they left again because the guards were heard running and yelling outside the hallway. It wasn't long before they knew exactly what went down. Izuku didn't know what the dragging noise was, but the others seemed to, and it piqued their interest. The chatter of the guards had gone from frantic to casual, and it took 3 of them to drag what was obviously a new captive into the new vacant cell in front of them. It was covered in the large billowy gray clothes everyone here wore, but after it was unceremoniously rolled into the cell, Izuku knew exactly what it was. That was another human. Just one? Where did he come from? Was he looking for Izuku? Were there others? If no one was looking for Izuku, would other humans come to find this man? He didn't have to wait long before he could ask these questions and more himself. But what the— Hey! The blond man's head shot up in Izuku's direction, eyes wide in surprise before a wide grin spread across his face. Izuku couldn't keep the emotions held inside and he began to cry, upset that someone else had been captured but so glad to have something familiar nearby. Lost kid, I found you. Me? Yeah. I almost thought I'd never catch up. Well, this isn't much of a rescue yet, is it? The man laughed as if he hadn't been captured by space pirates. Izuku slid closer to the bars, trying to get as close as he could to this physical representation of hope and rescue, to bask in words that he could actually understand again. The name's Taishiro Temitsu. You can call me Toyo. I would have been one of your instructors back at the station, but then those kids had to play that nasty trick on you. Don't worry, we got everything on surveillance, you aren't in trouble and everyone involved has been dealt with, but, well, we're really in a pickle here, aren't we? Yeah. Hey, you're not hurt, are you? No, I'm okay. Well, I did fight with the guards the other day. It was in self-defense, I swear. They were trying to pluck this alien's feathers and they were so scared. I was only really electrocuted a little. Their sticks are kinda like weak tasers. They used the toad alien to put me to sleep afterwards and put some kind of muzzle on my face because I bit one of the guards, but it was pretty easy to break and they haven't come back with a new one yet, so I'm hoping they gave up, and… Wow, you really have a set of lungs on you, huh? Don't worry, that's a good thing. We love inquisitive minds at the station. Dr. Garaki said something about you having potential and it's hard to impress that old bat. Anyways, I'm going to talk to your friends real quick, okay? Have they been treating you well? I think they were scared of me at first, but I guess the fact that I didn't attack anyone and helped when the guards barged in before helped show them that I'm not a threat. I hope so at least. I don't know any common yet. Don't worry about that, you've got Toyo-sensei here to save the day now. I'll be getting a sense of the bigger picture after I speak with everyone and then I can let you know what we should expect. I'm assuming you've had an eventful few days. On behalf of the whole space program, I apologize that we let this happen. Toyo, who hadn't stood yet, content to just sit against the wall mirroring Izuku, bowed in apology. Izuku waved his arms around in a slight panic. No, it's okay. You couldn't have known that one of the kids would set off an emergency alarm and pull such a big prank on me. The fact that you came to find me is more than I could have asked for. Toyo just smiled broadly, laughing off Izuku's panic. Afterwards, he turned to the group hiding in the corner, speaking common for the first time and drawing the attention of Aizawa. Toyo wanted answers and someone was going to give them to him. They'd somehow managed to catch another Terran Death Worlder and this one was obviously much larger than Izuku was. Aizawa hoped it was a gender difference, or maybe even some kind of mutation, anything but the confirmation of his theory that Izuku was truly a child of their species. Izuku was instantly transfixed on the new Terran, getting as close to the electrified bars as they could to get a better look. The new Death Worlder groaned as it woke up, but Izuku called out to it, gathering its attention right away. It didn't react like how Aizawa thought it would, baring its teeth at the smaller Terran. Izuku returned the gesture, but Aizawa could not for the life of him figure out just what these Death Worlders were truly feeling. The large one was baring its teeth, but sounded upbeat as it spoke, and Izuku sounded relieved but was very obviously crying. Eri didn't seem very bothered, so he assumed it wasn't anything too bad. Maybe Terrans had to establish a hierarchy upon meeting one another? Aizawa wasn't sure if Izuku knew this other Death World. Call him callous, but Aizawa was glad they put it in a different cage. He was sure that Izuku would be happy to be reunited with another of their species, but their cell was already cramped as it was. Then the Terran spoke to them in common. Hey, can anyone tell me what's going on? Everyone's eyes locked onto the new Terran. It was almost creepy in how it spoke. It sounded exactly like the computer-generated text-to-speech communicators. With a start, Aizawa realized that the Terrans must be in their probationary period right now, and because they were such good mimics, as proven by Izuku, they were using technology to learn Common and were able to pick up the language without any species-specific accents. Common as it was intended was decidedly creepy, but fairly easy to understand. Aizawa stepped forward to address the Death Worlder. I am Soda Aizawa, flight instructor for UA and a licensed pro hero of the HPSC. You have currently been captured by a group of criminals participating in underground fighting rings and black market trades. At this time we are unsure if there are rescue efforts in place to free us, but the statistics say that odds are slim. My students and I have been here for nearly 4 full lunar rotations. The Terran made a whistle that would make Zashi proud and nodded the same way Izuku had in affirmation. Sorry to hear about your capture. I'm Taishiro Toimitsu, human instructor on alien flora and fauna for the new HPSC-approved space station orbiting our home planet. You can call me Toyo. At this time, I can confirm that there is no one from our company that is coming after us. We're considered a lost cause. Aizawa's fur bristled at that. A lost cause? From what little interaction Aizawa had with Izuku, it was apparent that humans were very prone to pack bonding, to the point of near-lethal self-sacrifice in either high-stress combat situations or more subdued actions like Izuku's refusal to hoard food. They absolutely did not have to allow Mna to receive her nightly yanjine. Izuku was fully capable of fending her off for it, yet they still asked to take small portions for their own survival. Toyo bared their teeth at Aizawa's reaction and he shrunk back in submission. Toyo was quick to explain their actions. Ah, sorry about that, I always forget. If humans bare their teeth and the corners of their mouth point up, that's a sign of joy. Sorry if the kid scared you at all, he hasn't had the chance to learn anything about the given HPSC curriculum yet. On his first day at the station, another human set him up and long story short, the poor kid was ejected into space with no idea on how to fly the escape pod he was tricked into. The human, Toyo, was no longer smiling. What a terrible thing to do. And now Azawa could only lament that yet again his gut hadn't been wrong. Izuku was a child, not unlike his own students. They were still in their first year at UA. But Izuku had barely even started his first day. At least he now knew that Izuku was a male. How young was he? Azawa was afraid to ask. Instead, he praised Izuku's actions thus far. Izuku has been a pleasure to be around. He has smiled around us, but he has never bared his teeth in our direction. The only time I remember him baring his teeth was at the guards when they attacked us and the corners of his mouth were pointing down in an obvious scowl at the time. He has gone out of his way to make us feel safe around him and done everything in his power to keep us out of harm's way. You should be very proud. It wasn't every day that Azawa doled out such high praise, and his students' minds must be imploding at the fact that he could deliver any kind of positive feedback without his emotionless droll. But Azawa meant every word, and if they got out of this alive he would do everything in his power to ensure that Izuku would be well educated and taken care of until he could go into whatever career he decided to. Oh stars, he was attached, wasn't he? Oh well, at least he couldn't take Izuku home like all the other strays that Zashi always complained about. If they got out of this alive he would sell his soul to Nizu to get Izuku into UA, no questions asked, and from the look that Toyo was giving him, they could see it too and approved wholeheartedly. The kid really is something, isn't he? I never even got to meet him before storming out to my ship to track him down, but I'm glad I did. He seems like the kind of student I hope to have in all my classes. Azawa listened as Toyo spoke, and they seemed like a competent teacher, but Azawa was still confused. If you don't mind my asking, why have you both been written off as lost causes? You are obviously a well-educated instructor, valued for the knowledge you can pass on to the next generation of explorers, and Izuku is a student under your care. Is it not the duty of a school to take care of their students whilst they're under the school's supervision? Toyo's face soured. At first we thought that Izuku had set off an alarm to steal an escape pod for a joyride, but after reviewing the security feed we discovered that he was tricked and framed by another student. All students involved have been expelled from the program and sent back to Earth for legal review, but there was still the issue of him being missing. Our emergency pods aren't very fast, so the ships we used to patrol would have easily caught up to him, but he was captured by this merry band of idiots before we could get to him, and the homing beacon on his escape pod grew too fast for our ships to catch up to. The pods have camera feed for safety reasons, so it was easy enough for us to see what went down after we logged into its frequency. This kid really is something else. The student that tricked him also fooled him into turning off the autopilot. At first he didn't realize, but instead of touching any of the controls he was able to find the flight manual for the pod and start reading it. Any other student would have tried to figure it out themselves and probably would have ended up making the thing spin out uncontrollably, but even after he realized he wasn't going to a safe house he didn't grab the controls in a panic. I've never seen anyone read an instructions manual so fast. It would have been funny if not for the situation. Anyways, the kid was able to slow down the pod all by himself. Keep in mind our technology is archaic by your standards, so we have pressure nozzles that shoot out gas in the direction we want to accelerate or decelerate in. It's like steering a boat with paddles over soap-covered ice, but he managed it. He was even able to turn the pod around to try and head back to the station, or at least nearby enough that an adult could have picked him up, but that's when our lovely gathering here caught him. They waited until he was turned around before turning off their ship's cloaking device and deciding to strike. He might have assumed it was one of us at first, until the doors were opened and that Fogget shot a dart at him. Once he was captured, they hightailed it out of our territory. Again, our technology is leagues behind yours, so even an older ship like this one can outpace the best of ours. At that point, all we could do was report the situation to the HPSC officials in our area with a description. Do you want to know what they said? They said that Izuku was a very rare specimen, and if they put a spotlight on him that he would only gain unnecessary attention to potential buyers, and that because Terran Deathworlders, as they so kindly named us, are unknown to most of the galaxy, that it was safer for us as a race to let the kid meet his fate. Our own officials actually agreed with that assessment. As if the quiet death of one child would help keep humanity safe. I get it, politics. Humans are strong, great for fighting rings, and if Izuku was used in any and gained traction with the universe on the lookout for his whereabouts, it would make others want to capture their own humans and so on and so forth. But Izuku is a kid with more potential than I've seen in a while. I decided that I was going to keep following his pod's homing beacon. They said that I could only go if I returned after his escape pod lost its signal due to distance or we reached the edge of the system, and that if I didn't return that they wouldn't be coming after me either. I took that chance and was able to catch up after these schmooks stopped at that last planet, which wasn't too far away from the outside of our system's borders by the way, and now I'm here. I don't want to scare the kid. I haven't told him that he's been abandoned yet. I told him that I'm here now because I was someone who wanted to rescue him and I stand by that. But I don't want him to get depressed because government programs refuse to keep the people they're supposed to protect safe. Aizawa agreed wholeheartedly. One of the reasons he'd started working for UA was because the HPSC cut corners when it suited them, and Nizu absolutely refused to leave anyone under his protection behind. Losing Aizawa and his current students has been the biggest blow to UA in recent history, and he knew that they wouldn't stop searching as long as their whereabouts were unknown. No one was supposed to know where the Terran Death World was, so Aizawa had no gauge on how close or far they were to UA, but after nearly 4 lunar rotations he was doubtful they were still in the area. As long as they skirted the much larger HPSC territory, they were bound to get found though. They couldn't use Aizawa or any of his students in fighting rings because the bounty for their return was probably higher than what their captors would make in any bets made for or against them. With such a large group missing, it was a stain on the UA record, but it also meant that their faces were most likely plastered all over the known universe. All they could do was hold out hope for rescue, and if their capture helped save these Terrans abandoned by society, then that in and of itself was at least one silver lining. Toyo wasn't going to lie, he was pretty shaken up about the whole being captured thing, but he found the kid. He'd reached his goal, and even if this wasn't the rescue he imagined, he would be damned if he didn't try to keep the kid's spirits up. He was a teacher at heart and would do everything in his power to keep Izuku safe, even if he had to act a bit scary first. He had his opportunity when lunch was delivered. He heard the cart at the same time that Izuku did, both their heads swiveling out into the hallway in sync. He heard the Senki mutter about how creepy it was but ignored it to start enacting his plan. Izuku let him know it was just food, but Toyo had a mission. He stood to his full height, 6 feet 8 inches and tall by even human standards. He knew he was an intimidating figure and his face was set in stone by the time the guard arrived. They flinched when they spotted him. Okay, I want you to listen to me and listen good. That Death Worlder you have in there is a child, and we take the safety of our children very seriously. If even one hair on his head is harmed, you can bet that I will find a way to break out of this cage and dismember each and every individual in this crew. Do I make myself clear? Weiss, very good. Now pass along the message to your superiors. Toyo didn't remove the scowl from his face until after the guard had finished delivering the food and scuttled away, and then he sat back down against the wall with his usual smile back in place. Everyone in Izuku's cell was tense now. What did you just say to the guard? Oh, nothing much, just a quick warning is all. Man, I'm surprised we get such a nice selection. Not even all the HPSC members know we can't eat danga root yet. Danga root? Toyo had only really meant it as a distraction, but this was the perfect chance to start teaching Izuku in the field he excelled in. Yeah, it's an essential component to most universal rations. It has vitamins inside that most species need to survive, but it also has some proteins in it that are too harsh for humans to digest. Don't worry, you would know not to eat it, they smell like a car wash. Toyo grimaced, having been one of the lucky few to help test and determine what humans could and couldn't eat. When Izuku stayed silent and looked away, Toyo got a bad feeling. He instead turned his attention to the others. Please tell me that the reason we have actual food is because Izuku was just starving himself and they took notice. I'm not stupid enough to believe they somehow knew that we can't eat danga root. Toyo's eyes shifted to the eep of the group when they whined and started to shift uncomfortably. It was my fault. I was worried that he wasn't eating and convinced him to eat the rations. I'm sorry. Toyo turned his attention back to Izuku, food forgotten as he scrambled to the bars. You ate the rations? Kid, those things don't smell anything like food. What were you thinking? How much did you eat? Did you throw it back up? How long ago was this? Are you feeling okay? Izuku slumped against the wall and sighed in defeat now that he was found out. Knowing this tone from whenever his mother got worried about him, Izuku gently removed Eri from their usual place on his shirt and encouraged her to eat the rest of her lunch with the others, offering a small smile to them before turning to the mother hen in the cell facing theirs. I'm fine. I only ate the one pellet and I threw it up a few hours later. I was only really nauseous and don't remember any other side effects aside from how dizzy I was when I finally tried to move afterwards. I slept it off and by the time I woke up I was okay, I swear. Toyo sighed in relief, but then started to lecture his new student, waving a finger in his direction as he did so. You know that could have gone a lot worse, young man. Lesson number 1 in my class is to never eat anything you're unsure of unless it is an absolute emergency. You see these fruits? I know that they're approved for human consumption because I was on the team that worked with the HPSC to figure these things out, but even if it smells good doesn't mean it's edible. Is there anything else I should know about? Izuku flushed and looked away before mumbling. What was that? I couldn't hear you. The lorange, sir. None of that's your business, I'm not that old. What's a lorange? Oh right. I didn't know what it was called, so I just started calling it a lorange. It's some kind of citrus they bring in from Na, the pink sheep-like alien. They're called eeps, kid. Okay, so let me guess. It's purpley pink, larger than any other citrus we have on Earth, and tastes like if they spliced an orange with a lime? Just, that's it. Before they knew I couldn't eat the rations, I may have asked if they could share some of their fruit with me. Toyo barked out a laugh. Oh, this is rich. They're called yanjines, kid. How did they react? Well, at first I don't think they knew I was civilized like them. I can't speak common like you, so I just held up one finger to ask for a slice. I took my piece and gave the rest to them after. It smelled really good, but then Azawa moved and I didn't want to have the fruit taken away, so I might have, shoved the whole thing into my mouth? Toyo was full out laughing now. Man, I bet that must have been surprising for them. Kid, eeps are the only species aside from humans and some insect species that can digest citrus. Even then, eeps don't actually eat the fruit. They store the juice in a special layer of their skin and can use it to squirt at predators in self-defense. To other species, it's almost like acid. It's not corrosive enough to hurt skin in most cases, but it will absolutely hurt them if ingested. Azawa was probably worried you would hurt yourself and you must have blown their minds. I know the feel. The HPSC brought in the yanjines because it was a requirement for testing, not realizing that humans would take to them like candy. Just add a little sugar and they make the best juice. Izuku smiled and laughed at that, and Toyo turned his attention back to the group. Thanks for sharing your yanjines with Izuku. He's lucky that everything that smelled good to him has been edible so far, but I'll be sure to teach him what is and isn't human safe properly when I have the chance. For now, just keep in mind that the universal rations go through rigorous testing for every new species that enters the galactic frontier, and they're currently working on a version that humans can properly digest. Na nodded, surprising Toyo a bit since that was a more human thing, but smiled nonetheless. Bakko didn't know what to think. It had only been a few solar rotations, and yet his view on Deathworlders had already shifted in so many different directions. At first he was wary. Azawa was never scared of anything, but when Izuku first arrived, Bakko couldn't describe the look on his teacher's face as anything but fear. Then it didn't attack them, and he thought that his teacher was overreacting. Was this really the fabled race of savages that easily fended off the strays? They certainly didn't look like much. Then it attacked that guard, and Bakko remembered why he trusted his teacher's judgment. Those teeth were blunt, but they were dangerous. And then another backwards weakness. What kind of creature could eat yanjines of all things, but not ration pellets? One thing was made clear though, this Deathworlder, Izuku, had earned Bakko's respect. The moment it decided to arm them with a weapon and still try to defend them while unarmed, it gained his respect. The fact that it didn't falter even after getting electrocuted and was still willing to take on a group of enemies in a fight it knew it probably wouldn't win awed Bakugo. Until he could prove himself, Bakugo would fight to feel like he had worth as a warrior again. After the Terran was taken out, Aizawa ordered him to stand down and return the baton quietly. Even though every nerve in his body screamed at him to fight, to fall beside his new sibling in arms, Aizawa was his superior and he knew that fighting back would be futile anyways. Aizawa telling him that he was proud of Bakugo for following orders only soothed the sting of defeat a little. Izuku had fought hard to steal that weapon, and he spat on that effort by willingly returning it to the enemy. He was a stain on the warrior title for rolling over in defeat without putting up any kind of fight, and he wanted nothing more than to let loose and rip something to shreds. It also bothered him that Izuku tended to act meek and lacked the strong will befitting their abilities. It was probably for their benefit. Bakugo could admit that he was wary of Izuku, and the Terran making itself small and quiet helped calm his nerves, but it also didn't seem to have any backbone. Bakugo had tried to give it an out by yelling at Mna to back off when she was bothering it, but it still decided to eat something it knew it shouldn't have. Bakugo would have yelled at Mna for a stunt like that, whether or not they could speak the same language. Then the new Terran, Toyo, arrived. Izuku was just a kid. He wasn't even sure how young Izuku was in Terran measurements, but the adult in the cell right in front of them was very large. If Bakugo wasn't sure if he could win in a fight against Izuku, then he was sure he'd lose against Toyo, especially when they stood to their full height and threatened the guard delivering their food. Toyo had also earned Bakugo's respect for that act, as well as his fear, but he'd ever admit to being scared of anything to anyone. Bakugo couldn't fault Izuku for acting submissive towards the obvious leader in the cell just across from them, but he also couldn't fully understand the attachment they had to Eri now. Before he assumed it was just parental instincts. Eri was a kid and Terran seemed like the kind to protect their young, but Izuku was also a kid, they shouldn't have those parental instincts yet, so how had they gotten so attached to someone they couldn't even understand? It was almost sickening with how sweet they were with her too. The damn thing was starved and yet cute baby eyes were able to convince them to share with her when they knew that she had her own damn food to eat. Again, Bakugo would have understood if it were instincts. Dragons were feral when protecting their young, but Eri wasn't Izuku's young. That mystery would need to wait another day though, because after dinner, Izuku began to fiddle with the muzzle they now hid behind the toilet's privacy wall. What was it doing? Oh, okay, so not just its teeth were strong. Even young Terrans had the strength to pry apart welded metal, good to know. It wasn't just prying apart the metal either, it was straightening out the spokes. For what? What was it going to do with the metal scraps? It had some kind of plan, that was for sure, because as it worked the metal into thin V-like shapes, it spoke with the other Terran. Out of nowhere, the adult touched the cell bars. It didn't get seriously hurt though. Even Denki would have had quite the shock if he touched those bars, but thinking back, Izuku had been able to hold onto the guard's baton while it was sparking before too. Were humans resistant to electricity? It did hurt them. Toyo waved their arm a bit and sucked on their finger after getting shocked, but whatever they said to Izuku must have been encouraging. Izuku made sure that Eri was latched onto Aizawa before approaching the bars and tentatively touching them. They were careful to only allow the bars a quick feel before moving back, but they had even less of a reaction than Toyo, only briefly wiping their finger on their top before trying again, laying their palm over the bars. They were able to hold their palm against the bars for several ticks before grinning in a way that sent shivers down Bakugo's spine. The Terrans had a plan, and it already seemed terrifying. Izuku would admit that he was quite proud of himself. The locks for these cells were different than ones on Earth, but similar enough that the wires he was able to salvage from his muzzle might just be able to do the trick. He modified them to fit visually by using the lock on Toyo's cell as a reference, but there was still one problem to address. The guard's keys all had rubber handles to avoid the electric current constantly being fed through the bars. Hey Toyo. What is it, kid? I think I have a plan to get everyone out of here. Oh. Well, if anyone can do it you can. What do you have? Well, after I bit one of the guards, Toyo, who hadn't processed that little tidbit during Izuku's previous mumbling episode, made a noise at that, but Izuku continued, not giving him a chance to recover. They put that muzzle I mentioned before on me so I couldn't do it again. I was able to break it off pretty easily and I just made some lockpicks with the wires that I think might work. The only problem is that the bars have electricity flowing through them and I don't know how to turn them off to test my lockpicks out. Toyo thought for a moment before replying. What if you didn't have to? What do you mean? I'm gonna touch him. What if you get hurt? I'll be sure to only do it for a sec, but we won't know until we try, right? Toyo approached the bars and quickly poked his finger against them, hissing and sucking on his finger after, but it wasn't really that bad. I've been tossed before, kid, and it's not quite that bad. It's like a step above a static shock, but it's more annoying than painful, just don't hold on for too long. Izuku nodded and tried it out himself, finding it tolerable. After being able to hold his palm against the bars for 5 Mississippi seconds, he was sure he'd be able to pick the lock to their cage. Then there was the toad issue. Okay, I think I can pick the locks like this, but what about that toad-like guard? If they catch us, we'll just be put back and they'll figure something else out. Toyo rubbed his chin for a minute before snapping his fingers. How many times have you been hit with their neurotoxin? You mean their darts? Twice, I think. Yeah, the first when they captured me, then again later on. I think the second dose might have been weaker because they were aiming at everyone behind me though. I wasn't out for as long and I was able to stay awake for longer before passing out. I'm not so sure, let me ask your friends real quick. Toyo switched to common before addressing Azawa, who'd been watching them curiously as everyone got ready for bed. Hey Azawa. The kid says he was shot with Fogget neurotoxin twice. The first time I can guess the guard got him with the usual dose for something his size on capture, but did they say anything about his second dose? He says it was probably weaker because they were aiming at you guys. Azawa paused for a moment to process. He's wrong on both fronts for his shot while with us. The guard warned us that the amount he was giving to Izuku would be enough to kill anyone else in our cell, and we weren't allowed to warn him. They pretended to aim at us so he would take the shot without dodging. It worked, but it took a while to take effect and he was fighting it the whole time. How long did it take him to go down? At least 40 ticks, but I was more focused on other things at the time. That's fine, it sounds like it was stressful. Izuku and I are working out an escape plan right now, but there are things we need to plan ahead for. The Fogget on their team is an issue, but Izuku already has a head start on that. Given enough exposure, humans can become resistant to some toxins. The fact that he was able to fight off such a high dose of Fogget neurotoxin means that if given more exposure it won't affect him enough to keep him down. The only problem is how to get him that exposure. Azawa was glad that Toyo had included him in their plans. I have an idea. Make Izuku pretend to be sick. I'm not sure how good you are at acting, but maybe if he acts sick we can play it off as withdrawals. Izuku was given 2 doses in a short amount of time and then not given any afterwards. We can say that humans get addicted to foreign substances easily and cutting them off suddenly is bad for their health. I like how you think. As much as I hate to admit it, I think I also have an idea to get the desired effect, but we're all going to hate it. I have no doubts he'll agree to it too, which should be concerning, but it might just be our ticket out of here. Toyo then turned to speak with Izuku, who had been waiting patiently while he and Azawa were talking. Hey kid, I know I gave you an earful for it earlier, but would you be willing to eat another ration pellet tomorrow morning? I guess I could, but why? The dart they used to knock you out before wasn't meant for the others, it was meant for you. If it had hit any of them they would be dead right now, and I'm not saying that to scare you, it's just the fact that humans, well you know the famous quote, humans are space orcs? Yeah, that's the one. Anyways, that dose they gave you was way higher than the first one you got. The fact that you shook it off so easily the first time must have spooked them, but thanks to that you've grown a bit of a resistance to it. If you eat a ration at breakfast you'll be sick enough by lunch that we might be able to convince them that you're suffering from withdrawals. We might just be able to get your tolerance up enough for an escape attempt if we do, but it's up to you on whether we take it that far. Think you can act sick enough without the pellet? Izuku steeled his resolve. I'll do it. Toyo smiled a toothy grin. The guards didn't know what they had coming. Humans are insane. That was the only conclusion that Azawa could draw when Toyo went over their plan last night. It was good to know that danga root wasn't lethal to humans unless ingested in large quantities, whatever that meant in human terms, But the fact that Izuku was willing to go through the obvious discomfort he had before was a testament to their iron will. Na refused to be the one to put him through that again, but Bakugo surprised everyone by offering one of his own pellets. He scoffed, saying that it was just repayment for all the rations he got while Izuku couldn't eat his own, but Aizawa had a sneaking suspicion it was a bit more than that. Regardless, Izuku ate the pellet after the guard left, not touching his own food aside from some water to wash the ration down. Eri was content to munch on his fruit, and the rest of them split the remainder of his food so it wasn't as suspicious, but the little deathfly sprite was concerned again as Izuku's complexion paled. They had warned her that he would be sick again, but for something that could sense just how terrible he was feeling, it was hard for her not to worry. Izuku was able to hold himself together long enough for Toyo to give the signal when the guard arrived. Izuku wasted no time before rushing to the toilet, throwing up what little was left of the pellet and anything else that was still in his stomach at the time. The guard came rushing down the hallway, cart abandoned, to stare at Izuku in horror. The Death Worlders were a valuable commodity after all. What happened to the Death Worlder? Na was the best actor out of the group. Well, Aizawa could act fairly well, his job sometimes required it after all, but he'd already established his true nature during his capture, and frantic worry would look fake on him. We don't know, he was fine this morning. She played her part well, everyone else showing appropriate amounts of concern. It wasn't even all fake, which was the real kicker. The only thing keeping them on track was that fact that he wouldn't actually die from this. Toyo took his K to lead the conversation. Please tell me you guys only used Fogget neurotoxin on him once. The guard seemed confused, not knowing who to focus on, shifting his gaze from Toyo to Na and back to Izuku, who was still retching into the toilet. I think they used it twice. Why? Is it an allergic reaction? It's been too long for that. Toyo groaned convincingly, rubbing his forehead in what seemed to be obvious concern. Humans could be surprisingly good actors, which added yet another mark to how terrifying their species was in Aizawa's book. He's addicted, you morons. Humans don't process chemicals in the same way you do. Our bodies adapt and decide whether or not they like the new stimuli. You gave him 2 free naps in a stressful place, and now his body's hooked like he started using trigger. Aizawa flinched at that. The stuff was highly addictive to most species, and using the intergalactic drug as a comparison drew a grim picture. From the look on the guard's face, it was the right picture to draw. What should we do? Is there anything that can help it? Toyo pretended to look thoughtful for a minute before somehow making a loud click with their fingers and making their pre-planned suggestion. He can't stop cold turkey, the longer he goes without it the worse off he'll be, but if you guys can give him his fix in smaller and smaller doses over the next several days, he should be able to beat it. He's still young after all, he should be able to bounce back from this quickly enough. He won't be able to eat like this, so today I think you should give him 2 doses, one small one now so he can sleep this off, then one tonight after dinner so he can actually sleep during the lunar cycle. Starting tomorrow, it should be okay to just give him 1 dose to help with sleep until he doesn't need it anymore, but it's probably already this bad because he didn't get any during the last solar rotation. The guard ate up the instructions, agreeing quickly with Toyo's suggestions and rushing off to inform his superiors. They must really want the humans in good shape for sale if they were willing to go this far for them. Toyo yelled something over to Izuku in their language, and Izuku only had enough energy to hold up one arm, placing its opposable finger in the air in response. It must have been a human thing because Toyo laughed afterwards. They were lucky that there wasn't much known about humans and their biology yet. The guard tasked with delivering food returned with their Fogget companion, who grumbled but shot a dart out at Izuku after he finished his last bout of violent vomiting. Izuku went down for a mid-cycle nap, and the rest of their meal time went relatively smoothly. Aizawa wasn't sure how long it actually took Izuku to fall asleep because they had planned on having him act as if the neurotoxin was working properly. If asked, they would just explain that adrenaline had prolonged the experience last time, but they needed to put the guards at ease regarding its potency. Aizawa did, however, know that Izuku was only out for as long as it took the guards to come and collect their food trays. Either the dose they used was fairly small, or Toyo's explanation for how fast humans could become immune to substances was, as usually seemed to be the case, understated. Fortunately, Izuku's nap seemed to help with the backlash of eating the ration pellet, similar to the last time he went to sleep after the worst of his nausea had passed. Unfortunately, he would have to wait until dinner before getting anything to wash out the taste that was obviously bothering him at the moment. Oh well, he was a Death Worlder, he would be fine. Everything was going according to plan, which had Izuku excited. A few more days passed and Izuku could now say that he had been captured for at least a week, but with the way things were progressing, they should be able to fight back and hijack the ship soon. He was getting well acquainted with the Toad Guard, a faggot he had been told, and he could now confidently say that he would be able to fight off the toxin if needed. He barely felt the effects now and he was hoping that Toyo was right that he was growing immune and it wasn't just the smaller doses they were giving him every day. He still pretended to sleep when shot, but he was able to fight it off easily. He found that if he stayed awake for at least 2 minutes, then the forced drowsiness would fade into near nothing. All their plans hinged on Izuku being able to take out the faggot, no pressure. Toyo had begun to teach Izuku the basics of common while they waited for his tolerance to grow, and he now knew all of the names and genders of his cellmates. As he thought, Azawa was an adult and Eri was a child, crisis averted on that front, but he was surprised that all the others were young like him. Their growth rates were all slightly different, but in terms of species, aside from Eri, he was still the youngest in the group. For some reason, this unsettled most of them, but at least now they could communicate a bit better. Na, when given the chance, spoke a mile a minute, changing subjects too quickly for Izuku to fully follow while he was still new to the language, but she seemed to be content to just have someone listen to her for once. Bakko was standoffish but not nervous to speak back when spoken to. The others, classmates he'd been told, were still wary of him. The day finally arrived. Their best chance of escape would be to take out the faggot guard, and they knew that he would be coming to the cells like clockwork to help Izuku with his addiction after dinner. All Izuku had to do was feign sleep until the guards left, pick the lock before they could get too far, and take out the faggot so Toyo and the rest could take out the guards and assume control over the ship. No biggie. Izuku waited until the guards' footsteps were almost out of the hallway before standing up and heading to the gate. As soon as he knew they left the hallway, he took his makeshift lockpick and jammed it into the lock on their cell door. With just a few wiggles, the door opened and he was sprinting down the hallway. Fast, he had to be fast. He ignored the right guard as both aliens turned in his direction and immediately sucker punched the faggot. He was lucky they were so short, but he didn't have the time to dwell on the now felled guard since the Reich was reaching for their communication device. Izuku was able to grab it from their fumbling grasp and crush it under his foot before the guard could activate it. As he did so, he felt a familiar sting on his back. He turned to see the faggot with a smirk on their face, at least until a long black line smacked its head hard enough for it to bounce against the wall behind it. It was definitely out now, but they weren't done, because before Izuku could blink, the Reich had also been taken out. Glancing down the hallway, Izuku was relieved to see that the black lines were Azawa's tails. He didn't know they could stretch that far, but he would dwell on that fact later. They made sure that there was nothing that the guards would be able to use in their pockets before locking them up in their old cell, and Izuku got straight to work on unlocking the cell holding Toyo. It was laughably easy. It turns out that the locks were relatively simple in design on these older ship models, the system relying on the electricity to prevent escape attempts. The HPSC has of course updated their systems since then according to Azawa. They had no choice but to bring Eri with them as they started storming the ship, but she and some of the other weaker members of their group stayed in the middle surrounded by the rest of the group. Azawa and Toyo took the lead while Izuku and Bakko brought up the rear. It was quiet since everything was settling down for the night cycle and they kept their footsteps as light as possible. If they hadn't already spent several days with Izuku, the others might have been surprised at how eerily quiet humans could be on their bare feet, but Izuku had taken to pacing in the cell after the first few days in boredom. Now the only sounds were the tapping of Na's hooves and the clattering of Bakko's claws. Azawa led the way, knowing exactly how to get to the cockpit. They were almost free. Azawa and Toyo took the lead in storming the control room while Izuku and Bakko guarded the door and the others in their group from outside. There were only 3 crew members present, and after they were taken out, Azawa hit the emergency lockdown control switch. All across the ship reinforced metal doors slammed shut, locking all inhabitants in whatever rooms they were currently in. It was over, they'd actually done it. Once everyone but Azawa and Toyo were locked out of the cockpit area, They knew the plan had worked and Izuku wasted no time in leaning against the wall, laughing and crying. The only thing that could open doors now was the captain's keycard, and after a few moments Aizawa and Toyo walked out, Toyo wearing the keycard proudly. Izuku wasted no time in tackling the man in a hug and sobbing into his chest. Toyo chuckled as he reciprocated. Hey now, we're not done yet. We still have to sweep the halls and bring everyone who's not locked down to the brig. Think you can hold out until then? Izuku sniffled and nodded, pulling away with a determined look on his face. Toyo opened the door to the cockpit again and ushered everyone inside. Once there, Aizawa started to give swift instructions to everyone who would be staying behind. Denki and Shiro began to start resetting the coordinates for the nearest HPSC station while Na got to work on sending distress signals and communications to the nearest hero in the area. The remaining 4 heavy hitters left the control room, Izuku carrying 2 of the guards and Bakko carrying the captain, who'd so graciously given over his keycard when confronted. Toyo and Aizawa took the lead in storming the hallways until they returned to the brig. Bakko, stay here and watch over the outlaws while we finish the sweep. Bakko bristled, wanting an active part in everything. Izuku noticed this and knew enough common now to guess what was happening. Toyo? Can you tell Aizawa that I don't mind staying here? The tall man nodded before relaying the info over, but after a few words back and forth, Toyo smiled at Izuku apologetically. Sorry kid. You're lighter on your feet which makes it easier for us to sneak around, and you're strong enough to carry more than one criminal if we come across a larger group. Aizawa said that we need someone capable of taking out the guards safely too. I've worked with these species and I know what they can take. If you'd hit the Reich with the same strength you'd hit the Faggot earlier you might have done some real damage. As it is, Bakugo is better suited to using the right amount of non-deadly force to knock out anyone we bring back for him to guard if they wake up, and you're an emergency backup fighter if we somehow can't pull through. Aizawa is a licensed pro hero and shouldn't use deadly force and I'm his backup. You're the muscle who will carry anyone we find back here so we have our hands free. Think you can do it? It was strange that someone was calling him the muscle on a team, but they'd come this far and he could at least do this much. Looking back at Bakko, Aizawa seemed to have calmed him down with a motivational speech of his own and the Dragot didn't look as if he was 2 seconds from running off and trying to storm the halls himself any more, so Izuku nodded. The next several minutes were a blur of action while Aizawa led the 2 humans on an efficient loop through the winding hallways. Most of the ship's occupants were already in their rooms for the night cycle as cleverly planned by Aizawa, but there were a few staggered patrol groups and in the end the 3 scouts dragged 7 more unconscious aliens to a semi-patiently waiting Bakko. Toyo opened the door to the brig and Izuku went in first. As soon as he stepped into view of their old cell he was shot with another dart. The Faggot was furious. How are you still awake? Izuku gave a toothy grin, causing both cell occupants to flinch back. Terran Death Worlders adapt quickly. Comply or accept punishment? Izuku didn't know a lot of common yet, but he knew enough now to get his point across, even if it was overly formal and he sounded like Space Siri. Content after the 2 guards backed away, he nodded to the others, Toyo entering to stand beside Izuku to help block the hallway from view in case they tried to take a shot at the other 2. There was no resistance as Bakko and Aizawa dragged the remaining criminals into Toyo's old cell. As soon as the door to the brig closed behind them, both humans laughed, Toyo holding up his hand. Izuku hooped and slapped the palm with a resounding smack and startling the other 2 aliens, but they figured it couldn't be bad if the humans were now excitedly dancing in celebration. Neither decided to comment as they finished their jumping and returned to the rest of their small group. Na rushed to the door as soon as it opened, excitement in her eyes as she let them know that help was on the way. Zashi couldn't believe it. He'd spent countless cycles patrolling and searching for his missing partner and students. They'd very nearly been written off as dead by the HPSC, but after 4 lunar rotations a report of their whereabouts was handed over. Their captors had gotten sloppy. They had hidden away outside of HPSC territory to escape a hero ship hot on their tail, but with their captain's face known and a description of their ship plastered everywhere in search of the missing UA students. Someone had sold them out after they'd stopped at a nearby planet for an illegal underground fighting ring. It turns out there's no honor amongst thieves when the bounty is high enough. Zashi was quick to insist on being with the UA crew dispatched to intercept their last known trajectory. Despite his lack of sleep, Nizu agreed so long as he rested before they made contact, something Zashi easily agreed to. Nemri and pro-hero Ingenium, or Tensei as the other two knew him, were also scouted for the mission. Ingenium's ship was one of the fastest in their sector after all. Nemri was helpful enough to use her neurotoxin to help Zashi get some rest for their journey, but he wasn't expecting to get woken up so suddenly by the other two. Zashi? Zashi, we found them. Nem's on comms with one of your students right now. Zashi squawked himself awake. What? Are they okay? Zashi heavily stumbled with how quickly he rolled off the bed, and Tensei chuckled at his friend's antics. They seem fine. Apparently they were able to escape and take control of the ship. Azawa turned on the ship's emergency lockdown and left most of the students in charge of the control room to reset the ship's coordinates and send out distress signals. He and some others are currently sweeping the area to take out anyone who wasn't locked in their rooms. Both men were heading towards Tensei's ship's control room, where Nemri was happily chatting with one of the students. Now if Zashi was hearing correctly, and his hearing was fairly good. He smiled in relief at the bubbly tone the young teen had as she droned on, speaking to Nemri, who was doing a great job at distracting the Neep from her current situation. That tone meant that no one was seriously hurt or dead, thank goodness, and with actual backup and no one to protect, Zashi knew that Azawa could handle a simple sweep, regardless of whether or not he was armed. His soda had always been so smart. Zashi's team had been planning on striking in the middle of the lunar cycle when most of the crew would be asleep, but they'd beaten them to it, timing their escape in a way that meant they could lock everyone away when they would most likely be settling down in their rooms. He loved his partner and couldn't wait to reunite with him. Azawa returned to the control room before they got close enough to dock and board their ship, and Zashi almost trilled with how happy he was to hear his partner's voice. As soon as the ships were pressurized and Azawa used the captain's keycard to let them in, Zashi was at the doors, only just barely restraining himself from hugging his mate. Azawa didn't even try to keep the smirk off his face, but there was also a deep fondness in his expression. Zashi was so deep in his fixation that he almost missed the additional members of their group after arriving at the control room, despite one of them being quite tall. After cataloging their features, he almost screeched. It was only Azawa's pointed look that kept him from crying out in alarm. He probably should have been listening a bit better when they were being debriefed earlier. Azawa introduced the two unknowns as Terran Deathworlders, and everyone on the rescue team blue-screened at the information. That probably hadn't been mentioned before because Tensei and Nemri also seemed surprised, but they also probably wouldn't have boarded right away if they'd known who exactly was in their group. It wasn't that they didn't trust Azawa's judgment, it was just that Deathworlders weren't meant to be taken lightly. The taller of the two newcomers broke the ice, trying to seem as non-threatening as possible. Hello, my name is Taishiro Timitsu, please call me Toyo. I'm the human instructor on alien flora and fauna for the new HPSC-approved space station orbiting our home planet. This is Izuku, one of our students. We were captured after Azawa and your class, but we shared living quarters during our time here. Please treat us well. The Terran, or human rather, bowed at the waist, the smaller human quickly following suit. The fact that they were definitely sentient had the three responding pro-heroes sagging in relief. Hello, I am pro-hero Ingenium at your service. HPSC ships are currently en route to make contact with this ship and process everyone aboard. My services were requested specifically by Nizu of the United Association, so please excuse me while I contact him and debrief him on the situation. The human, Toyo, bobbed their head, and Tensei took that as his chance to head back to his ship and fire up his communication system. Hello, I'm Pro-Hero Midnight at your service. This here is Pro-Hero Present Mike. We're both teachers at UA and thank you for your assistance in rescuing our students. Both heroes flinched when the Terran bared its teeth, but the shorter Terran jabbed its elbow into their side and the mouth was quickly closed as they rubbed the back of their head sheepishly. Azawa's deep sigh after caught their attention. Apparently, humans smile while baring their teeth. If the corners of their mouths point up, it's a good thing. Trust me, if you see them scowling, you'll know. Well, that was comforting. Zashi took solace in the fact that none of his students seemed to be hurt, But before he could comment on the young deathfly sprite that was hiding behind Soda, Tensei came back. Hey, Nizu's on the line and wants to speak to the Terrans. Izuku still couldn't really follow everything that was going on with his limited vocabulary, but he was able to pick up that some HPSC heroes were on the way to rescue them. Azawa took over the comms when they returned to the control room, and within a few minutes there was another ship docking them. Azawa left with the captain's keycard and returned with 3 new aliens in interesting outfits. One looked like Big Bird from Sesame Street, if Big Bird was a chocobo from Final Fantasy, and wore shiny black leather similar to Earth motorcyclists. The speakers they wore didn't help differentiate from the image of the Earth's 1960s greaser style, but the aliens somehow managed to pull it off. One was a Fogget, though they were slimmer than the only other Fogget Izuku had met, and they had fewer bumps on their head and back area as far as he could see. Despite bad first impressions, he could tell that this Fogget was nicer, even if they jumped when Azawa first introduced them as Deathworlders. That would follow them for a while, wouldn't it? Izuku couldn't see the final alien properly through their armor. From what he could make out, it was some kind of insect-based sentient, but it wore a helmet that hid its face from view. If Izuku had to guess based on body structure alone, he would probably say that it was similar to some kind of beetle. Toyo would have a better analysis. Izuku was brought out of his observations when Toyo bowed. What were they even talking about? Izuku thought it was just introductions, but maybe he was thanking them for coming out to get them? Whatever the case was, Izuku scrambled to follow Toyo's example, but then had to elbow his would-be teacher when they smiled full force at the new aliens. You'd think after having interacted with other species for so long that you'd remember not to show teeth when smiling. Luckily, Azawa had opened the door for the bug alien to leave earlier, and the 2 that were still there didn't attack before Azawa explained human smiles. Before things could get too awkward, there was a knock at the door and Azawa let the bug alien back in, but right after Izuku was ushered out of the control room, following the group of adults as they boarded the hero's ship. It wasn't big, but it looked very fast. It was a fairly long triangular shape, almost like a jet but without actual wings, and the back had several thrusters that looked similar in design to the ones on the bug alien's armored elbows. The interior was very high-tech, at least, it looked that way to Izuku. He'd never been on an alien ship before, the one he was already on his side. Once they were on the flight deck, Izuku could see that there was a screen with an active video call on it. A white rat-like alien was patiently waiting on the other end. They perked up as soon as everyone was within sight, placing a hand in the air and doling out what was undoubtedly a human-like smile. The others seemed to shudder at this, but both Izuku and Toyo relaxed a bit, returning the gestures to the new alien's pleasure. Greetings. I am Nizu, pro-hero and principal of the United Association, or UA as you may know it. Izuku perked up, staring at the screen in wonder. He could understand them. Before he could ask, Nizu continued, we have recently updated our translators to include many widespread human languages. I hope that you can understand me at this time. Toyo grinned widely, speaking up for the both of them. You're coming in loud and clear, Nizu. It's an honor to meet you. How can we be of service? That's good to hear. There seems to be a misunderstanding, however. It is our endeavor to serve you at this time. Currently, we have HPSC personnel en route to your location. Normally, the protocol would be to apprehend the criminals and return all captives to their homes. However, as you are still in your probationary period and I hear that there were some complications with both of your approved access into the territories outside your jurisdiction, I'm not sure that I can guarantee a clean slate with the HPSC's involvement. Toyo frowned at that, rubbing his chin in thought. You might be right there. Izuku has a pass. He hadn't left the system before getting abducted, but I directly challenged orders and knowingly left our territory against direct orders, even if I wasn't too far away when I got picked up myself. What? Izuku was looking at Toyo in disbelief, eyes wide as he squawked out the word. Toyo had broken an intergalactic treaty to come after him? What about the others? The sheepish look he was giving Izuku was not reassuring at all. Nizu was the one to continue though, nodding their head in a humanoid fashion. Did he study human mannerisms? That was actually kind of sweet. Those were my thoughts exactly, and though my knowledge is limited, the circumstances of Izuku's capture also lead me to believe that returning to your station isn't an ideal option either. My proposal is for both of you to accompany my staff back to UA where we can gather all the facts, create a complete story, and then ensure that there will be no repercussions for any actions taken in survival or in the defense of those surrounding these events. Izuku's mind shut down and rebooted. At the United Association? He dreamt of someday taking virtual classes at the station that included other students from UA, but actually visiting the famous structure had just been a dream within a dream. Nizu quickly gathered Izuku's attention once again after giving them both a moment to process the offer. The representatives should arrive at your location sometime within the next half cycle, so you should come to a decision by then. Eraserhead will stay behind with Midnight to help process everyone on the ship. Ingenium and Present Mike will accompany you and the students back should you decide to come to UA. Nizu seemed like they were about to wrap up, but Izuku couldn't help but speak up before the call was dropped. One moment please. Everyone turned to him and he swallowed a lump in his throat. The Deathfly sprite Eri. Is she allowed to come too, or will she have to stay here on the ship? Nizu's eyes remained on Izuku as they gave a sharp nod. A wonderful observation. Ingenium did mention that she was in your group in his report. She has most likely imprinted on several of you in her time on the ship, and it would be detrimental to her health were we to separate her from you now. So if she also agrees to come to UA, I will grant my approval. Thank you for your time and consideration. I hope that in light of all recent events that things work out smoothly. It was a pleasure meeting you. The call dropped suddenly and now they had a lot to think about. Izuku hoped that Toyo would let them go to UA because even if his mother wouldn't approve, without a lot of convincing, Toyo had legal say in what they did now, and given the circumstances it seemed a logical plan. Izuku crossed his fingers as Toyo took in a deep breath. Please, please, please. I guess we don't really have much choice then. You ready for a field trip, kid? Izuku just barely restrained himself from jumping in place because he knew he'd probably just scare the new aliens in their group, but he couldn't help the beaming smile he gave Toyo. The man seemed exasperated but was at least pleased that Izuku seemed so excited. Just 1,000 times yes. I get to go to UA? The UA? Am I dreaming? I have to be dreaming. There's no way this is real life right now. Whoa, where'd all that energy come from? Take it easy, okay? We've had a long day and UA will still be there tomorrow. For now, why don't we head back with Azawa to fill in the others and get ready to head out? Izuku nodded his head vigorously, heading to the door and waiting for Azawa to use the keycard for access. Toyo shook his head and filled in the others since the universal translator turned off once Nizu hung up the video call. We agreed to come to UA per Nizu's request. The kid is excited, so don't mind him. He'll probably burn off some of that energy soon and sleep while we're on our way to UA. Thanks for everything so far. Couldn't have done it without you. Azawa shook his own head, copying Toyo as he started leading them back to the others. It's you we should be thanking. Without your help we would still be stuck in those cells. Eri latched herself to Izuku as soon as they returned to the control room, and she seemed to come to life after feeling the elation that was oozing off of him. He played it up, speaking to her in a mix of what little common he knew and his own muttered ramblings, speculating how things would turn out. The others were soon informed of the developments, and after a bit of shuffling Azawa led the way back out to the loading dock. Of course Ingenium's ship was still there, but off to the side, just beyond whatever ships the original occupants owned, were Toyo's ship and Izuku's escape pod. They were almost hidden, most of the other ships dwarfing the two human vehicles, but they were there and Toyo was just able to see them due to his own height. Hey, our ships are over there. They won't be able to take us to UA, what with how slow they are, but do you think your ship might also be somewhere behind them? Azawa huffed. Doubtful. They most likely pawned it a while ago. The only reason yours are still probably here is because they haven't had the time to try and sell them since you arrived. Well, that and they're much more valuable to the right buyer than our mass-produced HPSC training ships. The HPSC will bring them back to your system. Ingenium's ship can't tow them to UA from here. Toyo nodded. Yeah, I figured they'd be okay staying here. Mind if we head inside and see if anything's still salvageable? Azawa hummed in thought. I would say that you shouldn't try your luck. Usually, these kinds of things are gutted, everything not necessary for a bare-bones ship sale gets used for scraps or sold off separately, But since your species is so new, they may have tried to keep everything in pristine condition to sell as a novelty bundle. Good luck, but don't take too long. You should both leave before the HPSC representatives get here. Azawa padded off to speak with his disembarking students. He was holding Eri, the deathfly sprite, having fallen asleep some time ago, and Izuku watched him hand her over to present Mike before he followed Toyo behind the other ships. It would be weird not having Azawa with them, but Izuku was confident that the others would help keep present Mike and Ingenium calm while they were harboring unknown Deathworlders on their ship. Toyo was about to skip over the escape pod when Izuku paused. Wait, could you open this door for me? Kid, you didn't have any of your stuff when you got blasted off into space. What do you need? There were some granola bars in one of the compartments, and I remember seeing a first aid kit. You never know what you'll need until you need it. Huh, you really do have quite the head on your shoulders. Alright, I'll open up the pod for you. Just head on over to my ship afterwards. If everything is where it should be, then I know where I have a bag stashed away for emergencies. I mean, we're not supposed to leave the system, but you never know, so, as a flora and fauna expert, I may have everything I'd need to survive in a foreign wilderness. Maybe. Izuku no longer felt as bad about Toyo leaving the system to chase after him. From the sound of things, he probably would have gone off on his own as soon as the probation was lifted. The consequences set by the HPSC were way different than those set by human laws, and Toyo probably would have only gotten fined and put on temporary leave if he snuck out on his own after the go-ahead was announced, as long as he came back with something worthwhile. The inside of the pod didn't seem much different than when Izuku had been taken out. The pod's manual was open, face down on the floor by the main seat, but everything else was still in the drawers, just as Izuku remembered. The gray prison garb may not have pockets, but it was nothing if not large and flowy, so Izuku decided to use the front of his shirt poncho to carry everything he could with his lack of bag. Luckily, this only lasted until he arrived at Toyo's ship, where, miraculously, Toyo pulled another smaller bag out of his large camping backpack for Izuku to use. After grabbing a few other items, namely the surprisingly large bundle of blankets and pillows that Toyo kept in his ship's storage, the two humans returned to board Ingenium's ship. They were stared at, but no one questioned why the two humans were holding large piles of cloth and stuffing. Knowing them, rumors that humans needed nests to be comfortable would spread, but after having slept on literal concrete, Izuku was willing to let the half-truth be. Izuku was starting to crash from his adrenaline high now that things were calming down, but he did manage to muster up enough energy to get excited when Ingenium started up his ship. It would never not be cool going into warp speed. After a few minutes, the streaking star light couldn't hold his attention anymore, and Izuku made his way to the bunking area. It wasn't large, but Toyo already had everything set up and many of the others were already curled in a cuddle pile. Toyo stayed off to the side, and Izuku was only too happy to take the spot in between him and the others. He was out within a minute, but he knew that when he woke up they would finally be at UA. Lord Sasaki, I regret to inform you that the transport ship has been captured. There was an audible crunch as Sasaki gripped his pen hard enough for it to snap, ink dripping onto the table he was working at. The poor grunt who'd been tasked with breaking the news kept his head bowed, hoping that the ire dripping from his boss wouldn't get directed towards him. Explain, there was precious cargo on that ship. It was the Deathworlders, sir. When the ship veered off course, we began to intercept the communications. There was a riot. The UA captives mentioned they were given help by their cellmates, and the records we were able to pull mentioned that the Deathworlders were placed with them at the time. Saki sighed, hovering his hand over the mess on his desk and pulsing energy into the action. A few moments later, he was twirling his pen as if it had never been shattered. Losing the Terrans is a hefty loss, but they're more trouble than they're worth at this point. We took a gamble and lost, however we do need to keep working towards our purpose. Track the HPSC movements until we can locate the Deathfly sprite. We've used up too many resources studying her already, and starting again from scratch is out of the question. The guard was silent for a few moments and Saki grew terse. Was there something else? The grunt swallowed the lump in his throat and took in a shuddering breath. According to the intel we could gather, the Deathfly sprite and the Deathworlders have all been taken back to UA at this time. The grunt flinched when Sasaki growled. It only took a few moments for the mob boss to calm, sitting back in his seat with strained ease. No matter, they won't keep her there forever. Track all UA communications for the time being. We will find out when they plan on moving her back to her home planet and intercept them at that time. We cannot allow her to escape. Yes, sir. The grunt took his chance to leave and inform the others. Sasaki was still upset, but the grunt was happy at least to have escaped with his life. I know my plan will work, Sensei. UA has weakened since their loss, and striking now will crumble their reputation if an attack succeeds now. We can make a difference. We can show the universe that Hero Society is just an illusion. I just need a Nomu to set loose. Patience, Tamura. No good plan is made in a day. I know I can do it, Sensei. Just give me a chance. The man on the other side of the screen was quiet for several moments, and before a reply was given, Tamura feared that he may have finally overstepped his boundaries for once. Eventually the voice hissed back through the speakers. You will take Kurogyri with you to scope out the area and make a plan. If your plan is sufficient, then I will bargain with the doctor to use one of his creations. This mission is your responsibility, and I expect you to take its planning and resources seriously. Contact me again when you have everything ready. I expect you to plan for the unexpected. I will, Sensei. You won't be disappointed. The monitor displaying the video call went dark and Tamura stood from his seat. He had an infiltration to plan. While the HPSC was dealing with the criminals that ran the ship, one alien in particular slinked away to another area to hide out. It was a miracle that none of the representatives had recognized him, but he supposed that he had been missing for a while now. They probably assumed he was still in hiding after his last stunt. No, there was still work to be done. Hero Society was corrupt, and he could not allow himself to get captured before he purged more false heroes from the universe. One day they would see. They would all hear his words and listen to his message. Only those who fought to save others without the need for glory could be considered true heroes. He wished he could have seen the face of the Terran Deathworlder that had helped free them. He had heard enough of their plans from down the hall. The kid was young, but still willing to poison himself for the sake of the others. From the other snippets he'd gathered just from listening, he'd also fought the guards to help another and shared food even when starving. If someone like that child were to become a hero, then maybe, just maybe, he could retire the name stain and allow society to rely on them. He had no idea what future the Terran would have though, so for now he had to find an escape pod and leave undetected. He had a mission to complete after all. He hoped that Hosu wasn't too far away. The escape pods on ships this old were already slow enough. Izuku woke up in an unfamiliar room, but Toyo was there and it was well furnished, so he knew they hadn't been captured again at least. There was a window and Izuku could see that they were at a station, but he couldn't quite see just how big it was. As soon as he was awake enough to put two and two together, the blankets that covered him were flung to the floor, and he was standing. Toyo laughed at his eagerness. Whoa, where's the fire, kid? You've only been out for a few hours. You should go back to sleep. There's no way I could sleep now. We're at you. Why didn't you wake me? Kid, you were out for the count. I tried to wake you, honest, but you just didn't stir. It freaked the others out. They thought you were more injured from the prison break than they thought. I let them know that sleeping like the dead was normal for humans and carried you in. Really, you should get some more sleep. We have a meeting with Nizu scheduled for the morning cycle and you need to make sure you're acclimated. The standard galactic day is different than Earth's, you know. I figured it felt different on the ship. Toyo nodded, going into teacher mode. The terms they use can be confusing, especially since some phrases use the same words but mean completely different things, but I'll try to break it down for you. A cycle is what they call a half day, so there's the solar cycle and the lunar cycle. They essentially mean daytime and nighttime. A solar rotation is a full day. Technically, it should be planetary rotation, but I don't make the rules. A lunar rotation is different though. That means a month. Most planets have similar concepts for measurements of times, but the galactic version is the one that's used off home planets. A full day is 32 hours, very easy to divide into sections of cycles and half cycles or even further. Hours here are shorter than on Earth, so it's actually closer to a half hour for every hour they use. Well, hold on, give me a minute. Toyo opened his bag and pulled out a notebook with a pen bookmarking the next available page. Okay, here's the full breakdown. Galactic uses the easy-to-follow doubling sequence. For more than just time, but time is what we're learning here, so think 2, 4, 8, and 16. What comes next? 32? Got it in 1. Moving on, this makes things easier to label. Take the half cycle for example. The math is already built into the system, so it's easier to follow. What you have to understand is that Earth is a bit bigger than most other planets where sentience come from. Our gravity is higher, but it also makes our days longer than the galactic average. Seconds are called ticks, and they're essentially the same. You don't have to worry too much about the terminology outside anything shorter than a half day because the translators take care of that, but you do have to know the conversion rates. A minute is called a click, and it's only about half an Earth minute at 32 seconds. Their hours are called blocks and are closer to an Earth half hour because they're 64 clicks long. Using everything we have here, we can calculate everything else we need. In galactic measurements, 1 day is 32 hours, 1 week is 8 days, 1 month is 4 weeks, and 1 year is 16 months. All in all, it's not a difficult schedule to adapt to. In fact, when we tried to explain the system we use back home, they completely lost it at our months. They absolutely could not wrap their heads around the differing numbers of days. Well, that and daylight savings, because apparently most other planets don't have a super wobbly axis. Toyo was laughing now, done with his explanation of time, but Izuku was itching to take notes. He was utterly fascinated by the galactic system, and mental calculations were running through his head. The system was practical and easy to follow, and even if each general measurement of time was shorter than the Earth average, their years were still longer due to the quantity of months they had, and it all averaged out well enough to. Hey kid, you still with me? Oh yeah, sorry about that, I get lost in my head sometimes. You said we have a meeting later? Yeah. I spoke with Nizu a little after we arrived, but there are some things we need to figure out with you as well. There are going to be a few options for us, but from how things are going we have a pretty good idea on how things are going to go. They're going to be getting in touch with the station and your guardian in the meantime so we can have a full meeting. Izuku's eyes widened. My mom. Is she okay? Do you know if she was worried about me? Of course she was worried, but does she know I'm safe now? Toyo ruffled Izuku's hair. I haven't spoken to her yet, but I'm sure she's fine, kid. She wasn't the one that was kidnapped. Nizu assured me that the station has been informed of our rescue and by extension our emergency contacts. She knows you're safe now and is probably eager to speak with you again, so you should go back to bed and rest up for the day cycle. No need to get jet-lagged, I promise I'll wake you when it's time to get ready. Izuku nodded, mind now preoccupied with thoughts on how his mom was coping. She was already a nervous person to begin with, and it took a lot of convincing to allow her to agree to send him out into space where his father had met his own demise years prior. Izuku hoped that she wouldn't force him to come home. Even after everything, he still wanted to explore the stars. Izuku woke with a start, Toyo having shaken him awake. He wasn't rough though, and to Izuku's surprise there was a tray of steaming food on one of the tables waiting for them. Toyo smiled, clapping his hands loudly once. Rise and shine, it's a new day. Check this out and tell me what you think. Until he gestured at it, Izuku hadn't noticed the outfit change. Gone were the gray garbs, and now Toyo was wearing a yellow jumpsuit with white and orange decals. It's nice? Where did you? Awesome. I designed it myself. Did you know they have fabricators here? UA has a support department like no other, but simple things can be printed with the press of a button. Here, I already made a basic jumpsuit model, we just need to scale it down and you can customize it. Toyo looked like a kid in a candy store, but Izuku couldn't deny that the thought of clothes that actually fit again sounded nice. Toyo handed Izuku a large pad with the schematics for a jumpsuit displayed on the screen. The first thing Izuku did was change the bright yellow to a more reasonable green. The decals were fine, but he still changed the colors to white and red for the accents. Much better, and to his surprise the print button was labeled in English. Pressing it opened a compartment in the wall of their room, and before his eyes a machine began to create his clothes. So cool. It was kinda slow though. Great. It should only take a few minutes for your suit to finish. You should shower and get ready. I already fabricated toothbrushes, but you'll have to use the station's hygiene products. Some other species can't handle the harsh chemicals in our stuff. Nizu was still sure not to give us anything the HPSC hasn't already approved for human use, so everything else in there is good to go. Toyo punctuated his statement by tossing a towel at Izuku. Now that he'd had time to think about what would happen later, Izuku was nervous. He really hoped that his mom wouldn't pull him from the space program. He didn't know what he would do if he was earthbound until he turned 18 and could legally make that decision for himself. Still, a decent shower sounded amazing after being held up for so long. Izuku had managed to keep his hair mostly tangle-free in captivity, but that didn't stop the natural oils from building up. The shower, to Izuku's immense surprise, didn't look much different than an Earth setup. Was that intentional? Did all species use a similar building style, or was UA really so accommodating that they took the time to research and create something unique for every species? Everything was even labeled for easy use. Izuku may have been just a tad biased, but it felt like one of the best showers he'd ever had, and Toyo placed his new jumpsuit by his towel before Izuku had even finished showering. The toothpaste wasn't minty, but it was effective enough, and soon Izuku was ready to take on the day. Physically. Mentally, he was still reeling at the fact that there would be a meeting with Nizu, the pro-hero in charge of UA, and his mother. There would probably also be others present, but he didn't want to think about that. Toyo didn't seem nervous, so that helped at least. The walk to Nizu's office was relatively short. Toyo already knew the way since he'd checked in with everyone else before, but Izuku couldn't help but stare. The hallways weren't too different from those at the Earth station, probably an HPSC default in station structure, but there were more windows here, and any glimpse of the station's exterior and the planet they were orbiting was exciting to see. The planet, from the glimpses Izuku could get, looked similar to Earth. Large body of water covering at least 50% of the surface? Large land masses in various shapes and sizes? Unlike with Earth though, the land masses were all one general color, so the planet probably had one consistent biome across its equator. Izuku had no frame of reference for how big this planet was, he had no idea how far into orbit they were, and he had only seen Earth from his previous room window for a bit while he had been unpacking. Already he had several questions he wanted to ask about the system they were stationed at. Was the ocean down there also made up of salt water? Was their ocean even made of water at all? Was the surface green because of trees, or was everything a grassland? Did the flora and fauna change depending on how near or far to the equator things were? Did the flora and fauna differ greatly depending on which landmass you were on? Hey kid. Huh. You're muttering, you good down there? Izuku felt his face heat up. Yes, sorry. No need for that. From what I could pick up, you were thinking about some interesting stuff. We're almost to the office, but there's a call station right outside the hall, and your mom asked to speak with you before the meeting started. Will you be okay to talk to her before heading inside? She's already waiting on the line, but we'll be ready to start whenever you two finish up. She's calling now? Yeah, she's been pretty worried, you know. The station had to inform her of your disappearance as soon as we confirmed you were taken, and at the time things didn't look hopeful. It hasn't even been 2 Earth weeks since everything started, but having to hear that your only child went missing is hard to hear no matter how short the time frame. I'll talk to her. Just show me how to answer and I'll let her know I'm okay before heading in. Take your time, okay? The meeting can wait a few minutes for you two to catch up. Izuku nodded and Toyo showed him the monitor. With the press of a button, the screen turned on to reveal Izuku's mother, put up for a meeting yet still looking frazzled. Tears welled in her eyes as soon as Izuku appeared on her screen. Izuku smiled lightly, happy that she was okay. Hi, Mom. Inko immediately burst into tears, wailing loudly. Toyo patted Izuku's back before heading into Nizu's office. Izuku waited for his mom to let it out. She deserved it after everything. It was so good to see her again.